So good afternoon, everyone. I hope everyone had a good break. I sense that there was lots of relaxation and good chit-chat going on out in the atrium, and now we're back for our afternoon. It'll be obvious that we're getting a 2-for-1 this afternoon. We're having a presentation by Crystal Fraser and her daughter. Very first presentation by Crystal's daughter, but probably not the last. I'm very pleased to welcome Crystal. She is a PhD candidate from the University of Alberta and a Shirk doctoral fellow, which means she's a really good student. And she's the granddaughter of Marka and Richard Bullock, raised in Inuvik and at Tree River. Her PhD research focuses on the history of residential schools in the NWT, so very central and certainly very timely. And I'm welcoming Crystal and Quinn to make a presentation on post-secondary education. And so away you go, the two of you.
Okay, thanks so much. Just going to get set up here. I don't plan on speaking for the whole 45 minutes. I was hoping that we could have a conversation afterwards, maybe answer a couple of questions. I think I have a slideshow that should be up and going momentarily.
If you need anybody to hold the baby at any point.
Thank you. Okay. I think you're about the fifth in line, but we'll see how it goes. I had her at a conference in Yellowknife last week on a panel, and she just slept, yeah. So I'm hoping for the same. Okay, so thanks for attending this after lunch talk. I'm hoping that as much knowledge as I share with you, that you will share your knowledge with me. I really want to thank Jordan. I'm not sure if he's in the room at the moment. And to the Gwich'in youth who were really the driving force behind this whole trip. And I would also like to acknowledge that Carleton sits on unceded and unsurrendered Algonquin lands. So a warm Mussy Cho to you all, and I guess I'll just get right into it. So this is my grandmother. I've really had a lot of mentors in my life, and I really encourage everyone to get a mentor. They're really fundamental, especially as Gwich'in. We're always having to look to our elders, to our community for affirmation, for new understandings, new perspectives. So it's a really important thing. So my grandmother, Marka, was one of my mentors. And as some of you will hear tomorrow morning, I'll explain more about what I think the role of a mentor is. I'm kind of at the age where a couple people are now approaching me to maybe be their mentors. So it's a really exciting time. But for the moment, I would like to share with you my grandmother and her knowledge. So I remember when I was a little kid out at Tree River at fish camp during our summer months. I was always around my grandmother, my aunties, and my cousins. It seemed to be mostly a women-dominated area. We are known as the keepers of our culture. So lots of fishing, lots of artwork, lots of sewing, a really important time. So I'll never forget about that. But it was my grandmother, Marka, who taught me that cutting fish is really it represents sovereignty. So as a woman, as a Gwich'in, as someone who sits on our ancestral land, but also negotiated Treaty 11, the very act of fishing, cutting fish, and consuming fish means that we're free individuals. By connecting with our land, by engaging in a relationship with the animal world, by providing nourishment for our bodies, and also nourishment for other entities that we have a relationship with, such as our dogs, such as other animals that we leave offerings for. that is representative of us as free people. And it really goes to show that even though all of the damage that settler colonialism has done, that we still have fish. We still have our relationship with fish. We can still go fishing, we can still consume fish, and we can still really rely on fish. So what exactly are we free from? What is this settler colonialism that we're talking about? So we're free from wage labor when we're fishing. We're free from the paycheck. We're free, in a sense, from capitalism. We're free from city life and urban spaces, however we construct those. We're free also from alcohol and substance abuse. We're pretty much free from everything that holds us back as individuals. Certainly in more recent years, another mentor of mine and my cousin, Alistine Andre, has also re-articulated this message through the lesson that our greatest act of resistance is simply being on the land. If we can get back out on our ancestral lands and merely exist on our lands, that is mission accomplished. That will set us up to pretty much negate everything that the Indian Act has put in place, that residential schools have put in place. As long as we can get back onto the land, however we want to choose our activities while we're there, on the land, spaces and places are very important. But that's another story. So back to my grandmother, Marka. This photograph is from the Northwest Territories Archives. So certainly state place for knowledge. Circa early 1950s, she's at our family's camp in Tree River, and she's cutting whitefish. So again, fish means sovereignty. Fish means ancestral relationships. Fish is health, and fish is also critical to our very essence of Gwich'in. So my question is, what happened to the fish? Less than 2 weeks ago, my Uncle Sam, along with another man, was fined for purchasing fish illegally in Yellowknife from a Talicho fisherman. Charged with violating the Fisheries Act, the NWT court settled the matter by imposing a $1,000 fine on each party. Further, the fisherman himself, Narcissus Chocolate, an elder, was charged for selling fish that he harvested on his own lands. He has yet to be sentenced. He will be sentenced, and that is scheduled for June. Various local Indigenous peoples, along with the Dene Nation, have vocalized really why this is problematic, how this outcome is entirely colonial, how it is that after treaties, after modern treaties, land claim negotiations, this desire for a so-called nation-to-nation relationship, how this can still really happen. So, Marka, my grandmother, would not be very pleased if she heard that my Uncle Sam had been fined for purchasing fish from a local fisherman. I will add that my Uncle Sam was actually born in a canoe on the Tree River at my fish camp. So another layer of how fish provide for us. Now, I'm not a legal scholar, I'm a historian, but I am smart enough to know that there are a lot of complexities in legal cases like these, involving various parties from 3 different nations, the Gwich'in, the Talicho, and the NWT government. So each are engaging in some sort of economies of trade, whether these economies are actually rooted in Indigenous traditions or in settler colonialism or capitalism. Broadly, this story really encourages us to reconsider how we think about nationalities, about citizenship, and how we engage in socioeconomic structures. In a nutshell, we can think about how fish are really treated as symbolic of our relationship with the Canadian nation state. So you'll notice that my title says post-secondary education, like how does fish really play into that? So for Gwich'in, to pursue higher education, to attend university, we have to travel outside the GSA. We do not have an option. There are some correspondence programs, but if we want to get the so-called full experience of campus life, we have to go down south. And as someone who is Indigenous, who was remarkably unprepared for the experience of moving down south and attending the University of Alberta, one of the things that you have to grapple with is the Indigenous people of the land to which you're moving. So having some kind of working knowledge of who those Indigenous people are, also acknowledging that you are arriving as a guest onto somebody else's ancestral lands, but you do also have a shared common history of colonialism. More importantly, though, you will be faced with the very challenging task of engaging with settler Canadians en masse, so a lot of them everywhere you go. And coming from the GSA and the Northwest Territories, probably more generally, the population is about 50% Indigenous. So certainly, going to an institution, having to meet and engage with individuals who, their culture might be foreign to you, your culture definitely is foreign to them. There's all kinds of new questions, and if you lack supports, it can be pretty scary. So reflecting on my own experiences as a Gwich'in graduate student who now resides, I live in Edmonton, on Cree, Métis, Dakota, Dene, and Sioux lands, I really explore the fraught relationships among settler Canadians and Indigenous students in academic settings, both formal and informal. Characterized by an immense amount of white privilege and what some people could call blind ignorance, universities, which are supposed to be our highest centers of learning, are really fraught with stereotyping and racism. I think that we need to get back to the fish. As Marka would remind me, and I know she would, fish are the solution to so many problems. But I also have to think about my Uncle Sam's experience and how that really highlights the point that in the 21st century, fish are representative of a much more vexed and complex relationship between settlers and Indians. There is one thing we know for certain, that experiences are varied, never the same, and very nuanced. But I'm going to refer to a few different examples here that really highlight the complexity of Indigenous interests and those that are really invested in upholding academic and colonial infrastructure. So using fish as a broader metaphor to really unpack how we understand Gwich'in, especially in foreign settings like universities, I ask you what this could mean for our citizenship. Academia and its respective disciplines are really vexed colonial spaces in which Indigenous people are expected to fit into. Certainly, university campuses are really hotbeds of colonialism, whether you're a history major, political science major, engineering, what have you. Us Gwich'in are entering these disciplines and spaces with a unique worldview, but we are quickly expected to conform and assimilate into university life, but also into academic methodologies and ways of undertaking our studies and research. This has been my experience in training as a historian. But as Sarah had mentioned this morning, you certainly do not need a university PhD to be an expert or the keeper of very sacred knowledge. As a historian, written archival documents are always prioritized over the stories of our ancestors. Historical narratives are always written with the goal of celebrating some aspect of the Canadian nation state. And the audience is almost always assumed to be white, settler Canadians. So even as someone who is Gwich'in, Aboriginal, Indigenous, the histories that I write are almost always written for a settler Canadian audience. We need to start writing to each other. We need to start speaking to each other. Academia has helped to reshift some Indigenous histories, ones that maybe celebrate our ancestors or a few notable individuals. Some new historians have really harnessed the power of oral histories and no longer require the stamp of approval from the archives or from other academics, but those are really few and far between at this point. The dependence on stereotypes when starting your undergraduate and even graduate education are always an undercurrent in your everyday experience. And dialogue and questions that come from maybe other students, from professors, from administrators, will be underpinned by racist assumptions that always hinge on the understanding that Indigenous cultures are backwards, homogenous, or underdeveloped. Often we're confused with other First Nations, Métis, or Inuit societies. We must offer the Indigenous perspective when in reality there are hundreds of Indigenous communities across the Canadian states. So that is the kind of stereotyping that I'm talking about. Now, this is not always on purpose, and the intent of these kinds of questions has shifted over the past century, but really the fact remains that these questions based on racist rhetoric continue to keep springing up in universities. So earlier this year, or I guess rather last year, I took to Twitter to kind of air some of these grievances I was having, and I wrote a short Twitter essay. For those of you who are maybe not on Twitter, if you tweet, one tweet has to be 140 characters or less. So like a pretty concise one sentence line. And an essay, in my case, was 10 tweets. So just 10 simple statements that I wanted to make a broader point about this. So here's tweet number 1. As a university-trained historian, I'm immersed in a world of white privilege and work with colleagues who reproduce colonial sentiment. Tweet number 2. During my undergrad, senior professor tells me that Alberta has no Aboriginal history, so we focused on white people that semester. Tweet number 3. During my MA, my Master of Arts, I'm the only Indigenous person in the class, and professor called on me each and every time to get the Aboriginal perspective. That one is particularly problematic, especially considering that not all Indigenous people feel safe enough to be outed as Aboriginal, even today. Tweet number 4, at a recent SHIRC meeting, faculty member asks how to break into Indigenous communities when the community does not want research in the first place. Tweet number 5, when someone thinks you're white and makes a racist joke, then they apologize. Yes, this happens in higher centers of learning. So that would open broader conversations about what it means to pass for white, but also conversations about phenotypical racism and how it is that we use skin color and certain physical markers to make assumptions about race. Tweet number 6. Almost every conference paper I write, I have to assume the majority of my audience, I'm going to start this over. Tweet number 6. Almost every conference paper I write, I have to assume the majority of my audience is white and clueless about Indigenous people. Tweet number 7. The fact that historians write books like this one, making their careers and benefiting off Indigenous people. And then I have a link to a fairly problematic academic book in which the author wrote about the North, yet had never stepped foot in the community which he made assumptions about. Almost done. Tweet number 8. I presented a paper at a panel about Indigenous marginalization at universities, kind of like this one. Lots of squirming in seats, some people left. So we notice, if people leave. Tweet number 9, I have nowhere on campus to go where I can safely practice my culture. New science and medicine structures, yet no First Peoples house. Tweet number 10, 95% of the time, Indigenous people are not thanked for welcoming us on their land, sometimes only done when organizers know we will be present. So this Twitter essay was really an expression of my frustration at the system, but also the fact that I'm doing a PhD, I'm a part of the system. How is it that we can interrupt these spaces for really an honest conversation? Okay, so now that I've lost my place, when we start to interrupt these narratives, which are really based on archaic understandings of white supremacy, there is often trouble. No one likes a troublemaker. And I can see many people in this room who probably know exactly what I'm talking about. When you interrupt the status quo, you're no longer called on. If you say, I can't offer the Aboriginal perspective, but I can tell you what it means coming from a Gwich'in woman from Inuvik who was born in 1980, who is on, blah, 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 like really a unique perspective. We're no longer called on. We are sometimes uninvited to conferences. White settlers attempt to speak louder and with more convictions in order to silence us. But this is colonialism. This is continued colonialism in Canada. We do not live in a post-colonial country. Post-colonial means that it is over, and clearly it's not. Canada is just as colonial in 2016 as it was when the Indian Act was implemented in 1876. Granted, we have had more success in taking control of our future in recent years, especially through self-government, but oppressive political, economic, and social structures remain in place. So this morning, Sarah had mentioned that pretty much the system is still designed to take advantage of us. Certainly, I'm sure many of you watch the news, homelessness is rampant. Reserves and communities do not have safe drinking water. There are about 9,000 Indigenous people across Canada who are currently incarcerated. That number is ridiculous. So, how is all of this related to fish? As I said, fish are complicated, but so are our everyday lives as Gwich'in, as living in a colonial country. Fish and our relationship with fish have really persisted into our everyday colonial lives. This picture was taken 3 summers ago at my family's camp on the Mackenzie River. And that was after about 5 days of intense fishing, about 10 days of smoking and drying. We were getting ready to bundle all the fish. So when I think back to my grandmother cutting fish, the process of actually cutting the fish, like sitting down and cutting the fish, you would think that that's fairly simple. Now, I'm not saying that cutting fish is simplistic. I'm saying that it is simple in the sense that you sit down to cut fish. But it's not simplistic in the sense that over centuries, since time immemorial, we have investigated and researched the best ways of harvesting our fish. We have found the best fishing eddies. We have developed sophisticated ways of using the fish, of eating that fish, but also of engaging in this spiritual relationship with fish and the land. But what I'm saying is that my grandmother's relationship to fish was uncolonial. It was decolonial. It was based on her relationship to her family, because kin is a central aspect in Gwich'in culture, but also to the spiritual world, and it was a key part of her own identity. So this photograph was from the same summer. This is coney that we had cut into strips, and it's drying. The thing with coney is not everyone likes coney. It's a pretty richly flavored fish. It has a lot of fat, it's greasy. So when you cut it into strips and dry it in this manner, you can literally see the fat dripping off of it, especially if it's warm out. Now, if we think about my Uncle Sam and his experiences less than half a century later, after my Grandma Marka was cutting her fish, it's far, far different than what she ever experienced. So my question is, can fish, like this coney here is dripping with fat, can fish drip with colonialism? If we think of our lives as Gwich'in in this so-called modern world at universities, higher centers of learning, in cities, out of the GSA, engaging with settler Canadians every day, do we as people drip with colonialism as fish do? Certainly, we must acknowledge that although we are the oppressed and not the oppressor, do we actually benefit from colonial structures like capitalism? Are we ready to start to have these conversations about how fish is colonialism, about how we have adopted some colonial practices? Are we ready to have honest conversations, not only among our own people, but our universities and administrators and professors willing to go beyond the recommendations of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and have some pretty frank and honest discussions? How is it that we get around and resist these structures? So fish camp is a lot of fun. That is me that same summer cutting fish. You simply have to show up at fish camp, and Sarah is right, you can get a PhD on the land, and I tell you, it is way harder. You're using tools that are sometimes centuries old. You're on land that really have stories attached to it, historical significance, but you also have to be ready and willing to work. Can you haul water? Can you make a fire? Do you know what happens if a bear comes looking for his offering? Do you know water safety? Do you know where that fishing eddy is? Can you cut 80 fish a day? So really a lot of things that are overwhelming, but how also as a person, how does your character respond to all of these new teachings? How do you fit into this world of being Gwich'in? How do you interact with your elders when you're under pressure and stress? So all of these lessons wrapped up into fish. So when we look at fish and getting out on the land and cutting fish, but we also have to think about Uncle Sam, who has really had to grapple with a Canadian settler legal tradition, because that is what it is, a Canadian settler legal tradition, a Gwich'in man and a Talicho man engage in trade, and that is illegal. We've had these relationships with our neighbors since time immemorial. How is it that we can grapple with all of this, leading into self-government, leading into the future, leading into the next 40? That's my question for you. Masicho, thank you. Okay.
That was great. I'm
Thanks.
just going to ask for questions. Great. Well, thank you so much, Crystal. I was looking at all that dry meat, and my mouth is watering. It's very, just to add to what she's saying, you know, it's my grandmother sends me dry meat from Sigachik to Yellowknife every now and then, so it's quite an honor still to have people practicing. So we've got a bit of time here for some questions, and I'll leave the floor to Crystal.
Hey, Crystal.
Hi.
So, the world's real messed up right now, and the Gwich'in people got it pretty good in regard to that whole aspect, because we got lots of land, but I don't know if I really believe what I hear on Facebook all the time, but I like the fact that people are worrying, and they say, like, the ocean fish not going to be there in, like, 3 months' time, 4 months' time, like, mercury poisoning so over through the roof. So when you say fish is sole purpose, like, we probably have the freshest fish in the world, you know, and like just that alone kind of says our tradition is alive. And then you look at people who don't even got water. You know, like if I was a Gwich'in person, I was going to help, I'd probably help the Aboriginals first before I gave back to anybody else. You know what I mean? Mostly if you're saying they don't got water, they don't got fish, and they don't got this and that.
Yeah.
If you're to make any agreements or anything like that, mostly with the way the world's going, I think.
Yeah.
We got a lot of fish, man.
We do, and I think that's a really good point. You know, I think as Gwich'in, especially in the GSA, we've been extremely fortunate that we haven't had to grapple with some of the settler colonialism that has happened in the southern regions. Although our first residential school opened in 1867 in Hay River, we didn't actually have residential schools until the 1920s and 1930s in Aklavik. Now that happened about 100 years after many other regions in Canada, and I think that although, you know, of course, residential schools were tremendously awful and designed to assimilate us, if not kill us, that we somehow escaped some of the social pressures that came with colonialism in other regions, and fish being one of them. So through our land claim and self-government, we've really been fortunate enough to protect our lands from massive fishing industries, from some oil and gas exploration, and it really leaves me with a positive feeling that, you know, fish is also connected to language. So as we relearn our language and we train ourselves in Gwich'in to think about fish, that is going to bring all sorts of new ideas to the front. Yeah, thank you.
You know how to say fish in Gwich'in?
I don't.
Look, I think.
Look.
Look,
Look.
I think.
Okay.
Hi. Hello. About the post-secondary school and for the youth that plan on going there, or the kids that don't know about this conference, what is your advice to make them aware, I guess, of the professors or the people down south that are naive about the Indigenous history, I guess you could say? And how would you prepare them to go to post-secondary school with that without holding themselves and their tradition back?
Yeah, those are some pretty big questions, but thank you for posing them. You know, some of it is figuring out if it is first a safe space to even out yourself as Indigenous. You know, sometimes it's not safe to say that you're Gwich'in or Aboriginal. Sometimes you don't want to have to deal with, you know, stereotypical questions or racist comments. So first you have to figure out, like, if I do say I'm Gwich'in, that comes with a whole bunch of stuff. So am I prepared, and do I have the energy to deal with that right now? A part of my strategy is in these safe spaces and places that I did want to talk about my heritage and identity, because let's face it, sometimes you show up to class and it's 8:30 in the morning and you just want to be there to show up for class. You don't want to have to deal with all of this energy to engage in these conversations. But if you are in a safe space, I have just always been very persistent. you know, it sucks because there's so much more pressure on Indigenous students. You have to know your side of the argument, but you also have to know the other side of the argument. You have to be ready for any question that they ask, or else you're bombarded because there's always just you and 10 other people who, of course, want your knowledge and expertise, but maybe they don't have a lot of experience in these conversations. Another thing I found is social media to be immensely helpful. Create a network for yourself. Surround yourself with like-minded people. Phone your elders. Stay in touch with your community. Because a part of coming south for education is that it is foreign, but you know, our parents and our grandparents and our elders and our mentors, they also have to know what we're struggling with and going through. And that way, if back home has an idea of the challenges, they can help prepare kind of the next lot to go off. Yeah.
A lot that you said is really hits home, and I totally agree with you in terms of our existence being a form of resistance against colonialism. How do you see the young people here, or any Indigenous person, working more effectively, I guess, in terms of decolonizing themselves? What kind of initiatives can they do personally, or as a group of friends, or as a group of people, to not only get back to their traditions, to you know, help their nation, but also live in the world that surrounds us every day?
Yeah. Thanks for that question. That is certainly one that I have thought a lot about. And my approach might be simplistic, but it's worked for me so far. And that is find one thing. One thing it is that you want to do or change, or one statement that you want to make. For me, doing a PhD in history, my one thing at this moment is to change my discipline, is to interrupt these narratives, use oral histories instead of archival documents, show up at talks, make people uncomfortable, ask the hard questions, want to have honest conversations about how it is that we can change universities, how it is we can give Indigenous students a better experience, a more valued and rounded education. Choosing your one thing means that you will have about 1 million questions about that one thing. So it's really not just one thing, it's 1 million things. But in order to accomplish that one thing, you need to have the focus and the commitment to that one thing, if that makes sense. I don't know where Jordan is. There you are. Yeah. Okay.
Hi. Yesterday we had Senator Charlie Watt come in and talk a little bit about his experiences growing up in Nunavik. And in his comments, he mentioned that co-management really doesn't work because there's this ministerial override. There's no real meaningful partnership there in co-management. So on the subject of fish, the DFO, at least nominally, is supposed to regulate fishing for the preservation of the resource going forward. As to whether they're achieving that or not is a whole other conversation.
Right.
But if Indigenous peoples and government departments are at least supposed to have the same mission statement, that being that the preservation of a resource for future generations, what does a meaningful co-management relationship entail in your view?
Yeah. I don't know that I'm entirely prepared to answer that question, but I will say that, you know, specifically from what I understand about my region and about our relationship to the territorial government, that that I would really advocate for more community-based talks, for more relationships with elders and not hollow relationships, real relationships where these elders are compensated really fairly for their time and expertise. That might happen in some cases, but actually my friend and I were talking about this at lunch, that it seems that sometimes in communities, like in academia, the same experts are always called on, the same elders are maybe always called on, and to really open that up and get a varied perspective of what that kind of relationship could mean, but also to look at our youth and our future leaders, what kind of north or what kind of fish or what kind of relationship do they envision for our future? So what worked maybe 30 years ago when we were negotiating our land claim might not work now. But from what I understand, unfortunately, even though in most cases the desire is there and the attempts are there in order to foster this kind of relationship, bureaucracy tends to really slow things down. So sorry, that's not actually an answer to your question, but that's the best I can do. Hi.
Hi. I was just wondering, as a non-Indigenous student, what role can I play as an ally in trying to change the culture around like academia and within the classroom and in the context, and how we can sort of work towards decolonizing the academy?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I think that's a really important question. So this is the other thing is, my goal is to interrupt these conversations and to provide a new perspective, but is decolonization actually the answer? Do we want to decolonize campuses? Because if you look at the history of universities and this style of education, it's really rooted in European thought. So to decolonize European thought from that is really centuries old might be another task, but I think that the role of friendly settler students would really be to, ask the same kinds of questions of your professors, like where is the Indigenous content on our syllabus? Why is it that we're only learning this from one perspective? Let's, as uncomfortable as it is, let's talk about white privilege. So really informing yourself about what the questions should be, and then keeping people accountable to actually following through. Thank you.
And then this will be our last question.
It's just a quick one. I actually went to Carleton many, many years ago, and I did Indigenous studies, and I noticed that all the Indigenous studies were taught by non-Indigenous professors and teachers. And I understand you're PhD candidate in history, and I was just wondering what you aspire to do once you're done your academics.
Yeah.
Because it would be great to have an Indigenous voice in institutions.
Yes, I agree. Thanks for that question. Well, I'm looking for a tenure track job. Yeah, absolutely. On the one hand, I'm very committed to academia. I see myself as interrupting academic narratives, as keeping academics accountable and on task. But on the other hand, I'm also, I miss my community. I miss the North. I would love to spend some time in Inuvik at Tree River at my family's camp. So I guess personally, I see my role at a university in the South with fairly strong ties still to the North. I'm a Northern girl, and I think that my research is always going to be around the North. My next project, I'm interested in the Dempster Highway, how a highway really changed a part of our country through so much men's labor on that highway, how they had to be away from their families, how it brought in other influences like alcohol, but also how this highway allowed some residential school students to drive home for weekends and reconnect with their families sometimes. So yeah, that's my plan, but thanks for asking that. Okay. Thanks, everyone.
I just wanted to add to that I follow you on your social media platforms, and it's very loud and very clear. So thank you for sharing all your thoughts with us. And I was very inspired by your talk. So, and I've been asked on behalf of Carleton to just pass along a small token.
Awesome. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Up next, we have Mandee McDonald, who's sorry, can't pronounce it. She just told me it, but she's from the western shore of Hudson Bay in a small town called Churchill, Manitoba, and works at Dechinta. Welcome, Mandee, and really looking forward to your presentation.
That was a great talk, Crystal. I'm going to point to a lot of the things you said throughout my presentation. I hope that's okay. Tansei, Mandee McDonald, Netsikasin, Mando Sipik, Otinia, Mishkego, Nia. I'm Mandee McDonald. I'm originally from Churchill, Manitoba. I now live in Sambake Denendeh. I moved there about 20 years ago with my mom and my little brother. I am Mishkego, that's Swampy Cree, and I am the program manager at Dechinta Bush University Center for Research and Learning. The way I'm going to structure this little talk, I'll share a little bit of information with you about the organization that I work for. I know many of you were here yesterday. You heard Erin give her lecture, so I'll try not to cover too much of the same stuff. And I'd like to tell you a little bit about how I got involved in the organization, and that includes some information that I wrote in my master's paper. And then at the end, I'll try to tie it in with a little bit of information about citizenship. Somehow, it'll all work out. So Dechinta, it is that's a Dene word denoting a very broad concept, meaning way of life on the land. And you pronounce it differently according to different dialects, but that is roughly what it means across the Dene language. We do land-based university accredited programming on critical northern issues. So we do 2 semesters a year, and then 1 to 3 one-week professional development short courses. The semester programs are 12 weeks long, and within those 12 weeks, we have 7 to 8 weeks of the intensive on-the-land delivery. So the next program is coming up on April 10th. So we are traveling out to Blatchford Lake via snowmobile from Deda. Our office in Sambake is on Chief Dragi's territory in the Acacia region of Denendeh, and our program, the Dechinta program, is about 120 kilometers east of Yellowknife, and that's still on Chief Dragi's territory. The courses are all co-instructed by regional elders, cultural knowledge holders, and Indigenous university professors from Southern institutions. The curriculum is all designed in-house, so it's designed by our faculty, including the elders and the knowledge holders. And our courses are all accredited through the Faculty of Native Studies at the University of Alberta, University of British Columbia, and McGill University. So Dechinta is really it's a wellness program and a leadership program. We cover a lot of really challenging content, what you would probably think about taking in a good Indigenous studies class in a Southern institution. But because we have our intensive delivery, 7 to 8 weeks, we cover 5 university courses. It's quite intensive. And we cover topics like the history of colonization in Canada. We look at specific Canadian legislation and policies, like the Indian Act and residential schools, and a lot of the policies that people have been talking about throughout the conference, and how they have impacted our communities historically and continue to do so today. which is a lot of really challenging things to learn about if it's your first time being exposed to that kind of information, which in the case of Dechinta and many of our students it is, because that's not the kind of thing that you learn in the public education system. When I was getting ready to write this talk, I don't really consider myself an academic anymore. I did go to university. I did my bachelor's degree in political science and a minor in Indigenous studies. And I did my master's degree in Indigenous governance at the University of Victoria. And when I was asked to do this talk, and then I saw research paper beside my name on the program, I was like, oh no, research paper. I haven't done a research paper in a few years. So I went and looked at my master's research paper and found this paragraph that I wanted to share with you because I think it's a really good way to sort of frame the program where I work now. So this is what I wrote. Indigenous research, resurgence, or emergent literature is more than a growing body of academic work. It is a set of practices, values, and beliefs enacted and embodied by many Indigenous peoples in community-based contexts. In IGOV's, or the Indigenous Governance Program where I did my master's, in IGOV's Indigenous Resurgence course, we studied the works of Indigenous scholars like Diagi Alfred, Wanani K. Trask, Lisa Sinceri, Eva Garut, Joyce Green, Leanne Simpson, Patricia Montour Angus, and Sib Commandant Marcos of the Zapatistas. All of these works were important contributions to the field of Indigenous governance, resurgence, and decolonization literature. And this body of theory is the kind of theory and academic work that we focus on at Dechinta. The main tenet of Indigenous resurgence is that Indigenous peoples will not achieve liberation from colonization from within colonial structures. Rather, liberation will come with the regeneration of and return to Indigenous beliefs, values, and practices. Resurgence actions reconnect Indigenous peoples to the natural world, their communities, and cultures. It includes actions like language learning, reoccupying traditional spaces, or reclaiming cultural practices. One of my professors in the program is a Cherokee scholar named Jeff Corntassel, and he and a bunch of other people now advocate for everyday acts of resurgence. And he argues that by focusing on everyday acts of resurgence, one disrupts the colonial, physical, social, and political boundaries designed to impede our actions to restore our nationhood. Indigenous resurgence means having the courage and imagination to envision life beyond the state. These everyday acts include things like ceremony, singing, dancing, visiting elders, sharing food, beading or sewing circles, celebrating our accomplishments, storytelling, fish camps, like what Crystal was talking about. For me, it's things like moose hide tanning, and a whole bunch of other stuff, which if there's time, I'll tell you some more good examples at the end. Resurgent acts promote kinship by strengthening relationships between individuals, communities, and between people and the land while fostering enhanced cultural proficiency and connection. By taking concerted efforts to reclaim and regenerate Indigenous cultural contexts without reference to colonial systems, definitions, or laws, resurgence theory posits that Indigenous communities can rebuild their nations and free themselves from colonial oppression. And I included this because Dechinta, it's university-accredited programming. We do engage with a lot of academic work, a lot of theory, but we take that theory and put it into practice. So we engage in community governance every single day. We engage in things like moose hide tanning, we set fish nets, and we make dry fish. We harvest traditional medicines, we process those medicines, and with all those things, we also learn the protocols behind it and how to maintain respectful relationship with the land, how to foster a relationship, and how to basically live in harmony with the natural world. And I think that's an important difference between Indigenous education, which is what we are trying to centralize in the Dechinta programs, compared to kind of conventional Eurocentric modes of education, and this was what I was trying to get at yesterday when I addressed your comment. I don't know if my point came across, but one of the things that one of my first jobs with Dechinta, I was a research assistant on a research grant that we were partnered on, and one of my tasks was to write a literature review on land-based education. And what I found was that there was not a whole lot on land-based education specifically, but there was a lot on place-based education from the perspective of Western or settler education theorists, and kind of the values of place-based education. And then there was a lot of literature by Indigenous scholars on Indigenous education, which is land-based. Indigenous education is informed by relationship to the land and some of the things that I was talking about, like how to be respectful, what offerings to make, and how to live in harmony with the constant flux, which is something Leroy a little bit wrote about, who Hayden talked a little bit about yesterday. But what I found in the place-based education literature is that some of the theorists I feel like there's a lot of appropriation going on in that body of work now, where people are borrowing from Indigenous education work and without really citing it properly. So there's kind of these two sort of separate fields going on. One is like traditional Indigenous education, and then one is new, innovative, place-based education, which is basically just ripping off what the Indigenous scholars write about Indigenous education. So it's kind of an interesting thing to read about. So one of the reasons that I think land-based education or Indigenous education is so important for me, I kind of started thinking about this a couple weeks ago when I was invited to this workshop. Dechinta is a part of this sort of collective back home called the On the Land Collaborative, and they invited us to a workshop where a bunch of other organizations who do land-based programming, we got together to figure out how to basically share resources and that kind of thing. And at the beginning, we started off by introducing ourselves and explaining why it is that we think land-based programming is important or something like that. And I was at the end of the circle, so everyone kind of went around and said more or less, really similar things. Oh, I grew up on the land and I love the land, and being on the land makes me feel healthy and whole and complete and all these things. And one thing that stuck with me that one of the participants said was, when I'm out on the land, I feel like my best self. And all that really resonated with me, but one thing that didn't quite resonate with me was that all these people, and it was a mix of older, like elders, Indigenous people doing programming in their home communities, and then younger kind of settler people who are doing also awesome land-based programming. But when it got to me, I was like, well, I agree with everything that you're saying, but for me, I didn't grow up with a lot of land-based opportunities. So I didn't grow up hunting and fishing or whatever with my parents. My grandparents died when I was a little baby, and then when I was young, my mom moved us away to another community for a lot of the same reasons that I think young, single Indigenous moms leave their home communities. And so I didn't know anybody, and I didn't get a lot of land-based opportunities. And it wasn't until in my mid-20s where I actually started feeling comfortable with people and asking Dene people in Dene to take me out with them and teach me things, which was awesome. And so a big part of what I do now is trying to make those opportunities accessible for people who didn't necessarily get them growing up, which it might be a surprising thing, but it's a lot of young Indigenous people don't get those opportunities anymore because so much information has been kind of lost intergenerationally through residential schools. And I know a lot of people don't really like the terminology of reconnection, like decolonization is about reconnecting to culture and land, because a lot of people are still very much connected, but I find that a lot of those people are elders, they're older people, and a lot of people my age, that dialogue around disconnection is still resonates pretty heavily. And you find that at Dechinta too, most of our students are Indigenous, most of them are Dene from the Northwest Territories, and most of them are women. And of a big chunk of those women, most of them are single moms. And everyone has kind of really similar stories about oh yeah, like my uncles go hunting and bring us meat and take my brothers and take my cousins, but I've never gone hunting, I've never set a fish net, I've never done this or that. And then when they get into it at the program, it's almost like a foot in the door kind of thing, and then you feel like you have something to build off, and then people go back home and continue to engage in these land-based practices. And the resurgence, cultural resurgence that I pointed to in my little paragraph earlier. So for me, I am a Dechinta student as well. So I did the program in 2011. I was in the middle of doing my undergraduate degree at UVic and wanted something kind of like less white and more cool and awesome to do. And I know they did moose hide tanning, which I always wanted to get into. My great-grandmother was like a pro moose hide tanner. My mom, my grandma, not so much. So I went out there for a week program, and it was when the program was hosting Prince William and Kate Middleton. So it was a really hilarious experience, like to think I'm going to like decolonization camp, but but actually the prince and his girlfriend are coming out too. So awesome, the symbols of colonial monarchy. I learned a lot, but that was also the first time I had an Indigenous professor teaching me a course. So those professors were Glenn Coulthart and Lois Edge. And Lois Edge did this awesome talk about beadwork as resistance, and I never heard anything like that before, and it totally blew my mind, and it really set me on a different path academically. Like, by that point, I was kind of sick of university. My major was in political theory. I still don't know what Locke or any of these people were really talking about, so don't ask me. But then I was like reinvigorated by all this like amazing theory that they were talking about, and finished my BA, did my MA, and one of the requirements for my master's program was to do a project-based research program. So instead of doing a research project, you do a project with a Indigenous organization or something like that. So I did my project at Dechinta over 2 semesters, where I just did student support and helped facilitate things on site. And then when my project was done, I was offered a job. So that was great. And I've been with the organization ever since then. In my proposal to my master's program, excuse me, I wrote about how I wanted to do my project around moose hide tanning, because I had just started learning how to do moose hide tanning. I was exposed to it for the first time at Dechinta by the moose hide tanning instructor. Her name's Mila Nakeko. She's also a movie star. And ever since then, she became my moose hide tanning mentor. So she invites me out to moose hide tanning camps. She's taught me a lot and set me up with a bunch of amazing Dene elders, moose hide tanners. And I've been like working really hard at that ever since then. And just last spring, I finished my first moose hide, and it took me 3 years, which is a really, really long time to be working on one single moose hide. And through that process, I feel like I learned so many incredibly valuable lessons that I would never have learned in a regular university classroom or in a book. Like, if you study decolonization theory or resurgence theory or anti-colonial theory and things like that, then you read a lot about the land, how important the land is to Indigenous people and our cultures and practices and everything like that. But if you're not actually like engaging in that with your hands and like working really hard, then you don't really get it, and it's really hard to understand. And I feel like through the past few years of just like really focusing on moose hide, I'm able to like really know what these people are talking about, and which is really important to me because I didn't grow up with a lot of elders around that I could talk to. I didn't grow up in my traditional territory with the rest of my family, so it's kind of went about it in a different kind of way. Like, I learned the theory in university first, and then was able to reconnect applying the theory to my life afterwards. So it was, great. That's how I went about it. And some of the core competency, that's just me. I don't know why I'm going to talk about Dechinta and just go tell my whole life story up on stage. I think it's the same for a lot of students who did the program. A lot of our students come to us, they don't have a lot of land-based experience, and then they get a little taste of it and they go back home and they can get right into it. Lots of them have taken on really important leadership positions in their community, doing like resurgence work with youth, like organizing fish camps and moose hide tanning camps, and doing really amazing things like that. Some of them are on chief and councils, and some of them went on to pursue more post-secondary education in the South. But having said that, before the program, they were not interested in post-secondary at all. They were only interested in the educational experience that we provide at Dechinta. And then by coming to the program and being exposed to this body of academic work, they then decide that it's something they want to do, and they move ahead with it, which is awesome. So how much more time do I have? 2 more points. And then you can ask me some questions, and then I have to go catch a plane. So some of the lessons around moose hide tanning, and I always really focus on moose hide tanning because there are so many lessons. Just like Crystal was talking about with the fish, there are so many lessons in a practice, like a seemingly simple practice. But moose hide tanning is so hard. Physically, it's like the most physically challenging thing I've ever had to figure out on my own. And it really sucked at sometimes learning it, because you think like, oh, if you just tell me how to do it, I'll do it and it'll be done. But like, you try so hard and you actually don't have the physical strength to get it to a certain point where it's ready to move on to the next stage. I remember times I would be like trying to get the flesh off and the hair off, and I'd just be crying because I'm like, it's not working. I'm so like, I can't do it. I don't have the capacity. And then my mentor would come over and just be like, done, kind of thing. And because there's a lot of protocol around working with moose hides. So, for example, all the parts that you take off, the hair and the flesh, you have to take care of those in a certain way. You don't burn them or put them in the garbage. You have to go put them out on the land with some tobacco. You can't think negative thoughts while you're working on the moose hide. You only think positive thoughts. You can't drink around it or smoke around it. You can't swear around it. All these things to really demonstrate your respect for the animal that gave up its life so people could eat and you could tan the hide and have this like beautiful, amazing smoke tanned hide to make amazing moccasins with and other clothes that people need. And I feel like all those lessons around respect are one of the major things that people come out of the program with. And when people are like, oh, what are the competencies that you learn out at Dechinta? And I feel like they're the most important competencies. And it's not just being at Dechinta, but it's being on the land and like working on the land and spending a significant amount of time on the land with elders. It's like self-confidence, which is a huge one, because you go through, as Indigenous people, you can go through the whole public school system with no Indigenous teachers, learning nothing about Indigenous people, learning all these, like, how great colonization was and all the settlers and explorers and how amazing they were. And you kind of come out of it being like, well, obviously I'm not important because I'm not represented in these stories and my people aren't in these textbook pictures. And confidence is a huge foundational thing that you need to like be successful and go for your goals and like anything in life. So that's a huge competency that people get out of the program. Communication skills, conflict resolution, resourcefulness. I have a whole list. Mindfulness and work ethic. Work ethic is the big one because working on the land it's so much work, but it's awesome. And I liked, sorry, Crystal, when she was talking about hauling water. That's a huge part of the program. We spend hours hauling water out of the lake up this giant mountain to like drink and cook and clean, hauling wood, figuring out the right kind of wood you need to have a good fire, making the right kind of kindling, collecting the right kind of fire starter. And you know, it really makes sense, all these kind of not metaphors, but when people talk about, oh, the home fire, or like all these important lessons around the fire, you really get it when you're out in the bush and you're camping and it's -40 and you don't have the right kind of wood beside your fire and you've no fire and you're freezing to death. Like, yes, the fire is important. And then respect, like this is one of my last points I'll make, but I feel like all the teachings around respect and protocol, making offerings, how to think about certain things. Like I mentioned, when you're working on a moose hide, you can't think negative things at all, not just about the moose hide. And there's similar teachings around different animals. You shouldn't be thinking negative things when you're cutting a fish or when you're doing anything like that, out of respect for the animal. And that, I think, applies to so many other areas in life. You know, people talk about how lateral violence is one of the biggest challenges in a lot of our communities. And I think lessons around respect and protocol are really make you a good person. And it's a good foundation from which you can work towards any kind of goal, like educational goals or academic goals or leadership goals, anything you want to do. And last thing I'll say about citizenship and belonging. So this was actually something I really focused on a lot in my master's paper because, like I said, I'm from Churchill, northern Manitoba. My family comes from York Factory, and even further, like east over time, they made their way up that way to Churchill. Doing my project in Denendeh with Dene people, working with Dene elders, learning Dene teachings. I had to think a lot about how I fit in to the community and how to ground myself really in the work that I did. And it's a huge section of my master's paper, but in a nutshell, I was thinking, you know what, when you're out on the land and you're working, or you're in a community and you're doing good work, or out on the land, nobody cares where you're a citizen of, or if you have status, or what your status card says. All they care about is if you're working hard. Like, if you're working as hard as you can, nobody's gonna question you or say you don't belong there. And that's something I learned over like many years. And then people call on you for support, or people stay in touch with you, and people let you know what projects are going on and let you know how you can help. So I think that's an important thing to think about when you're thinking about citizenship. Well, in the way I think about citizenship. I don't know if that's how you talk about it in your public policy master's program, but that's something I think about a lot. And I just wanted to touch on this. I wasn't expecting to talk about this everyday acts of resurgence sort of angle, but I feel like for me, moose hide tanning is a big one. I spend a lot of my free time trying to like make tools in my house, asking people how the best kind of tools are made. I can work on that all year long. We set up moose hides in my backyard, set up moose hides at gatherings around Denendeh and back of people's trucks. Those are some examples. And then one thing I thought of, and I'll just leave it on this note, I don't even know if it's an appropriate thing to talk about right now, but one of the things we did as a group, some people I do work with back home around, there's this film festival back home called Dead North, and it's a film making festival. So you sign up and then you have to make a short film. And we signed up and we did this traditional Dene story, which was awesome. But it's a huge festival up north now. Within the film, we included this kind of ridiculous dialogue between these two young Indigenous women, and they were having a pretty like kind of hilarious conversation about cultural appropriation. But it was to a huge audience of people in Yellowknife saw it, and a lot of people who we think engage in a lot of cultural appropriation. So it's kind of a good way to use a platform to address things like that, like an everyday act sort of way. And if anyone is interested in coming to Dechinta, our next program starts April 10th, and it's full, mostly. If you really want to come, though, come talk to me. And then our next program, Aaron talked a little bit about what we're trying to get going with the Rivers of Reconciliation, and then our regular fall semester should start in the fall of this year. Thanks.
Thank you, Mandee. I think I'll make a quick statement about the work that Dechinta has been doing in terms of the engagement of the young people that we converse with on a daily basis, not just in Yellowknife, but in the Northwest Territories or Yukon. I think that the work that you guys are really, really important, and that I'm hoping that the Gwich'in youth here are inspired to apply, and I've talked with them over the last couple of days about it, and that one day, hopefully within the next year or so, or maybe a few years, we'll be able to bring it up to the GSA to maybe have a full cohort of Gwich'in participants participating in this program. But just a question that I think I'd like to start off the conversation based around how do you feel that we as young Indigenous people should be lobbying or trying to change policy in the North to create more programs like this for our communities?
Mm-hmm. Thanks. That's a hard one, and that is like that's a big tension, I think, because, you know, what I said in my little quote about not within colonial systems, like working with not within colonial systems, but you still need all this money to run these programs. So in iGov, a lot of it was about turning away from government and not really engaging and kind of working within the community to build capacity and facilitate opportunities for people to learn from elders and things like that. But then you go and you work for an organization that needs money to run programs. All of a sudden you're knocking on everyone's door, going for dinners with the MLAs, emailing like the Prime Minister of Canada, and it's a huge tension. So I don't really know. But one thing I feel like, I gave a little talk the other day, and a Tlicho guy came up to me and he's like, you forgot to mention, I forget now. Oh my God. The walking in two worlds, like a foot in both worlds. You forgot to mention that. Yeah, be strong like two people, exactly. That's what he said I forgot to mention. So for me, I hate being one of those people that went through university and then goes to communities and be like, you don't need university, da-da-da-da-da. But you kind of like, you do a little bit. Like you need those tools in your community. Not everybody needs those tools. Not everybody needs to go to university. But the people in the community, some people need to have those tools. And so that is like, if that's something you're interested in, then go to university and learn how policy works and work on policy for your community. That's a great option. But if it doesn't interest you at all and you want to just tan moose hides and work in a fish camp, like you need people on the land being on the land too. That's just as important. So I'm not going to say what you should do, but whatever your interests are, there's really important work for you to do based on that. Does that make sense?
Thanks for your presentation. I wondered if you could share any surprises you've found along the road of being involved with Dechinta. Anything that's really, taken you by surprise or stood out in your experience with all the students and different teachers.
So you just want me to tell some hilarious stories about how I had to chase a bear through the woods to get my moose hide back? There are lots of surprises. There were lots of surprises. I'm always surprised all the time, like pleasantly surprised, because the cohorts of students are all so amazing and so different. I learn a lot from the students. I see the professors that come, I hear them give like more or less the same lectures every time they come. I learn a lot from them too, but it's usually the students and how they react to the information. I'm not like too surprised by reactions anymore, but at first I found it surprising because I think I touched on this a bit, but when you, as an Indigenous person, you first start learning about colonization, systemic violence, oppression, and all these big systems that have been going on for a long time with a very specific goal to like destroy your culture so you're off the land and you're out of the way so it can be exploited. When you learn that, that's like a really hard thing to learn. And I went through that in university where I could go home at the end of the day, call my mom or talk to my roommate or whatever. But when you're out on the land learning it, and you are learning it with a bunch of other people who are also learning it for the first time, it's really challenging. And so I learned a lot about how to be supportive in that kind of context. And then another thing an insight I kind of learned, it's not a surprise. Well, it was kind of a surprise maybe, but it's about how being on the land is really healing. And everyone kind of says that. And yeah, everyone talks about how being on the land is healing, but they don't talk about it in the way that it's healing in the way a cleanse can be healing. Like you take a cleanse and it brings all these toxins from your deep tissue to the surface and you get really sick and then it expels them and you get better. Being on the land and doing this kind of program, I feel like is healing in that way because you're learning about how all these big oppressive systems impact you personally and your family and your community, and you're also trying to engage in all these practices that are supposed to be a part of your culture and heritage and you don't know how to do them. So that can bring out a lot of negative feelings, but then you process them on site and there's a lot of emotional support. You have elders, you have people who have gone through that process to support the students through it. And then by the end, typically students say that the program was like transformative or life-changing in that way, and you have kind of like a new understanding and like an unveiled reality in a sense, and you can see the world and understand how it works in a deeper way, and it's empowering. If you want to hear more stories about bears, I'll tell you later.
2 questions. You said that you use skidoos to get out onto the land. I was just wondering if you ever use other modes of travel like a canoe or a dog sled.
We don't, since I've been there, we haven't used dog sleds to get out there, but we used to have dog sleds out there so people could try it out. But it's kind of like, logistically, I feel like for me to organize that, I would have a lot of anxiety around it because there's such a big group of people. We're like 25 people. Like how many dogs would that be? 100. Hundreds of dogs. But people do take dog sleds out there. And we have never canoed out there because there's a really long portage. Usually we go out by snowmobile or we fly.
And I'm not sure if you said this, maybe I just didn't catch it, but what programs are at Dechinta?
Okay. Okay. So we have a roster of about 8 courses that we do. And the semester is a program in and of itself. So within a 12-week semester program, you spend 7 to 8 weeks on the land and you do 5 university courses. So in the spring, we're doing Indigenous Self-Determination in Theory and Practice. We're doing a course called Sustainable Communities. And within that course, we also do some practical hands-on things like the students install solar panels and learn how the solar power system at the lodge works. They've installed wind turbines. They learn how to run and operate and maintain the clevis, which is a giant human waste composting system, which is really fun. And then in the spring, we do organic gardening, we do subsistence harvesting, and a lot of things like that. We have a course called Community Health Promotion, which focuses on the social and environmental determinants of health in Indigenous communities. So we look at a lot of, intergenerational impacts of things like residential schools. Then we also look at kind of the power of Indigenous resurgence and cultural revitalization. We look at a lot of case studies from different First Nations communities around the world and the amazing projects they're doing and the health benefits that have come out of that. And then we have a course called Communicating Dene, which is a communications-based course, and we have different instructors who come and teach components of that course depending on availability. So coming up in the spring, Richard Van Camp is coming out to do creative writing and storytelling. In the past, we've had Ryan McMahon come out and do podcasting. We've had other kind of regional people do podcasting and digital storytelling, media broadcasting, how to do interviews and write op-eds and things like that. And then our core course is called Research on Writing and Native Studies, where we focus on entry-level academic reading and writing skills and community governance protocols and things like that.
Neat.
Yeah.
Just a quick question on that note. I commend you for this program. It sounds really exciting. I'm a professor here, but I almost feel like signing up there. I'm trying to actually do something similar with Arctic College in Nunavut in the Kitigan region. And I'm very intrigued. I just want to know from your program also, the question that comes up in the Kitigan region in Nunavut is, how can we create more local jobs that are on the land that then can complement being out on the land and actually making a living on the side? So I just wanted to know, what your experience was with the graduates from the program and what's your vision on that?
Well, the vision, I'll tell you the experience and the vision. So, Dechinta hires a bunch of people seasonally, all the elders, the land-based support people, the bush hands, the moose hide tanning instructors, the fish netting instructors. Everyone is contracted on a seasonal basis, and everyone is paid the same amount, including the support staff and the Indigenous professors. It's an important part of our philosophy that everyone is compensated equally for their time and knowledge. So our vision is to have land-based campuses in every region of Dende where there's interest, and there's already a few regions who have expressed interest that we're trying to work with, including the GTC, to try and make that happen. But there's a lot of work, and so every single semester would have a whole bunch of seasonal, paid contract positions for land-based instruction, including a couple of full-time permanent positions around for people to recruit and do outreach and things like that in the region. So every region would have kind of like a lead, and those positions alumni would probably best fill those positions. So we have kind of an informal policy around hiring. All new paid positions will go priority hiring to either the Yellowknives Dene First Nation, which is where our programs are, or alumni. So we have had quite a few alumni take on short-term contracts with us, moose hide tanning helpers and instructors. I do an outreach and recruitment tour every year. So this year I went to the South Slave and Fort Simpson, and alumni came with me and helped me with that. Last year I drove from Yellowknife to Fort Good Hope on the winter road and back, and I had an alumni from the program help me out with that. And then lots of other things depending on our financial capacity and what we can do. So I think it's a great program in terms of training people for things like that. But I think in all the communities, there's a lot of really skilled, knowledgeable people who can easily, or if there are resources that compensate them and things like that, they'd be happy to teach on the land. Yeah.
Hi, Mandee. Thanks so much. I learned so much from your presentation, and I just wanted to see if you could elaborate a bit more on maybe some of the hardships or roadblocks that Dechinta has had, and overcoming those, and yeah.
I hate which one. I try not to focus on funding, but I feel like it is the biggest challenge right now, because we don't have core funding. We spend all of our time writing grants and reporting on grants, trying to fit our own awesome qualitative evaluation systems into these kind of irrelevant quantitative metrics that our funders want us to fill out. So that's a really hard thing to deal with. Challenges, it is, like I mentioned, the challenges in the program, how difficult it is to learn some of these things, and being supportive through that process can sometimes just be tiring. But it's rewarding. Sometimes I get hurt. I twisted my ankle once and cut my hand open, working on my moose hide out there. Those are some of the challenges, but I think that there's been a lot of support. We do have a lot of support. A lot of our instructors volunteer their time because they want to support the program, and they know that our capacity is really limited. And sometimes people aren't really used to working very hard. They need a little bit of supportive, gentle prodding to go get certain things done. But all in all, it's not too challenging. It's pretty great.
In regards to Dechinta, what time do you guys wake up in the mornings?
Wake up at the crack of dawn.
6 a.m.?
Yeah, a lot of times, well, some people, the elders for sure, are up at 6 a.m. And it's hard to kind of get into that rhythm for a lot of people, including myself. But basically, you're supposed to go to bed when it gets dark out, and then you're supposed to get up when the sun comes up. But some people like sleep in a little bit later. We don't start class until 9 in the morning. Or you have to be there for class, whatever it is. If we're doing a seminar or a lecture or a tutorial, or we're going to check the fishnets or work on the hides or whatever it is. But we rotate around the group for whoever has to get up really early to start the fire in the classroom tent, put the water on for tea and coffee, start making breakfast. So some people do have to get up really, really early to get those things done. And then we have to try and get everything cleaned up and put away before it gets dark.
Like, just being in Ottawa today, I kind of really seen this trade-off this morning. I was up at like 6:30 a.m. and I went out for a smoke. And I seen so many, like, Jordan found this really unbusy place for us, but this morning I see nothing but vehicles going by at 6:30 in the morning. I'm like, holy crap, like all these people are up like 6:30 in the morning. But our people are sleeping. I think that's just a really big trade-off that I don't agree with.
Well, it's different in the city. Like, when you're out in the bush, you want to get up because you have to start the fire because it's cold. Like, you want to be comfortable. There's lots to do. I feel like in the city, you don't always have things you need to do first thing. So it's like you can get up and watch TV for a couple hours or go for a smoke. But then you're kind of waiting around for things to get started, 9 in the morning. But yeah, that's good. You'd probably do good at Dechinta, my friend. Please, come see me.
Solar panels, wind turbines, I'm fair.
Last question. Have you considered training people for tourism in outdoor settings, like outdoor adventure or outdoor education? Or not outdoor education, but tourism?
No, not really. But I think that the training that you get at Dechinta would be excellent assets for that field of work. But it's not. We haven't really talked much about specifically like tourism training program. I think anyone who is going to be working on the land or in the north would get a lot out of the program, not just specifically to tourism.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Mandee. We got a gift here for you on behalf of the GTC and Carlton. Look forward to working with you.
Thanks.
So I hope that we have 15 applications before the end of the week for your fall semester. Just as you were talking about your roadblocks, I was thinking about what Senator Watt said yesterday about how Indigenous people need to come together to be able to strategize and approach the government in that way. And maybe maybe something that Dechinta can do is approach all the Indigenous leadership and see if their organizations are, in support of the program, and maybe they could all chip in for a proposal writer for you. Because to be honest, I know how much time that takes up, and I think there's more important work to be done than writing proposals to the government and organizations across Canada. So just an idea, and look forward to the rest of the day, everyone, and I think we'll break until 3 o'clock and then come back and we got our keynote of the day. Thank you. welcome back. Our next presenter is a man with many talents. Whenever I get in trouble, he tries to run after me, but I'm a bit faster, so. But Tony Penikett is a member of the Gordon Foundation's Arctic Program Advisory Circle, and I'm a fellow on the Jane Glasgow Fellowship, so I work closely with Tony. And he's also an author of Reconciliations, First Nations treaty making in British Columbia, and currently is a Vancouver-based mediator. He was also the DM of negotiations for the British Columbia government and the Deputy Labour Minister. He also a senior advisor on self-government policy to Saskatchewan, and currently teaches at Simon Fraser University. And he is a former MLA from 1978 to 1995 and a premier from 85 to 92 in the Yukon. And he's been involved in Aboriginal negotiations for over 20 years. So, good warm welcome to Tony Penikett.
Thank you very much, Jordan. I always worry about Jordan's introductions because I never know quite what he's going to say. Being here today, looking at this lovely scenery out the window of the river, I was reminded of a moment in 1976 when I was here working on Parliament Hill and had a visit at my place from two Dene ladies, the famous celebrated journalist Edith Josie from Old Crow, respected Gwich'in elder, but also well-known writer at the time, and a younger Southern Shoshone woman from the Yukon. And they came to my door and they said they wanted to go to see the movie Jaws, and they wanted me to come with them. So, okay, I went to Jaws with Edith Josie and this other young woman. And we were sitting in the movie, and for the young woman from the Yukon, found it quite scary. And so she asked if she could hold my hand while watching the movie. Of course, I agreed. And in fact, as the movie got more and more scary, she was actually holding my hand so tight, she was actually digging her nails into my hand, so that by the end of the movie, my hand was bleeding. But what I found remarkable was Edith Josie was sitting there quietly throughout the movie, not bothered anything bothering her at all. And it was very funny, as we went walking out into the sunlight afterwards near the Rideau Shopping Centre, we ran into another Gwich'in elder, and I don't remember if it was someone from Fort McPherson or Old Crow, but anyway, they said to Edith, "Oh, where have you been, Edith?" She said, "Oh, we've been to a movie." And said, "Oh, what was the movie about?" And Edith looked at her and said, "It was a movie about a big fish." So, I want to talk about big fish, or as the Tanana people in my kids' family would say, Tlucho Shli Shlain Kai, or Gathe Shlain Kai. I want to be, given my great age, which Jordan always makes fun of, I'm going to reflect a little bit back on the last few years and particularly talk about the period in which the Northern Treaties were made, which began at the time of the Cold War, a period which we tended to have conveniently forgotten, but a time which was very rough on Indigenous people in the Arctic. It wasn't just a time of residential schools and a time when Indigenous people in Canada couldn't vote at the beginning of the Cold War, but it was also a time during the Second World War and at the period immediately afterwards when the Aleut in Alaska, for example, were interned just like the Japanese because they were politically suspect. The Inuit in Ngava and Greenland were forcibly relocated for strategic purposes for their own nation states. The Satu Dene male laborers were packing the ore that went into the bombs at Hiroshima and Nagasaki and worried very much about the cancer rates in the period following it. The Sami on the border of Norway and Russia were, families were divided, and so that people on both sides of the border lost communication with each other for the duration of the war and were suspect on both sides afterwards. And then the most famous case of Diomede and Little Diomede Island, which in the Aleutian Sea are separated by the international date line. One island was in the Soviet Union, the other one was in Russia. They were only a couple of kilometers apart, and when the sea ice, they could walk to each other, but for the duration of the Cold War, they weren't allowed any communication with each other, their own cousins and family members. And in that period, a period which was stark and colder, there's a sense in which Arctic Indigenous people were pawns in the great power struggles between the Soviet Union and the United States and other powers. And what has happened since, particularly with treaty making, has fundamentally transformed the North American Arctic. Particularly, it has altered relations between Northerners, settlers and Indigenous people, about which there's been much discussion today, but it has also dramatically empowered Indigenous communities. And I want to talk a little bit about that. As you all know, Alaska, the United States bought Alaska from Russia in 1867 without consulting any of the indigenous communities there. Not the Aleut, not the Dene, not the Inuit, not the Tlingit, although the Tlingit at least went on record as opposing the sale and objecting that Russia was selling something it didn't own. And 100 years later, when oil companies announced a plan to build a pipeline from the North Slope down to the southern part of Alaska so they could ship oil out, a young Inupiaq named William Hensley quietly told them, well, you have your plan to build a pipeline, but we think you should know you don't own the land on which you're going to build it. And that view was confirmed by lawyers in Washington who realized that in order for oil development to go ahead in Alaska, they would need to clear what was in America at that time called Indian title or Aboriginal title in order for these projects to pursue. And as a result, some fairly high-paced or high-powered negotiations then went on involving much backroom bargaining and lobbying, politically posturing, but largely in the halls of Congress. And eventually in 1971, Congress passed the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act, which gave Alaska Natives almost $1 billion and 178,000 square kilometers of land, which was the largest and richest land claim settlement by far in the United States. Now, at that time, Indigenous groups across northern Canada marveled at the scale of the Alaskan Treaty. And so after the Supreme Court of Canada's ruling in the Calder case, the government of Canada sent treaty negotiators to the Yukon, to the Northwest Territories, to northern Quebec, and to the British Columbia, areas of Canada that didn't have treaties. And in northern Quebec in 1975, with the Northern Quebec Cree and Inuit, the province of Quebec and the government of Canada signed the first modern treaty in Canada. That treaty provides beneficiaries with 14,000 square kilometers of community lands, extensive fishing, hunting, and trapping grounds, $225 million in compensation, and that word compensation is interesting because the federal government stopped using it two or three treaties later. A Cree family income plan for wildlife harvesters, and the right to use indigenous tongues as their official languages. Now, I'm going to talk about a lot of the numbers in the modern treaties here because I do so for a purpose, because I want you, younger generation, to appreciate the scale of the settlements that were actually achieved in this period. That treaty took less than 4 years to negotiate. By many accounts, a rush job, driven by Quebec Hydro's urgent need to pour concrete for the massive dams at James Bay. And this rush job subsequently required a fix-up negotiation in the Pays des Braves agreement between Quebec and the Cree. In 1984, while energy giants were drilling in the 476,000 square kilometer area of the Beaufort Sea, the Inuvialuit, fishers and hunters of the Western Arctic, after 5 years of negotiations, concluded a treaty with Canada. In this treaty, the Inuvialuit received fee simple title to collective ownership to 90,000 square kilometers of land, including mineral, oil, and gas rights on a portion of those lands. And the Inuvialuit also received compensation of $45 million. The Inuvialuit agreement may also, I would say, be the best written of all the northern treaties, simply from the fact that it had two principal negotiators from beginning to end. In contrast, I would say a treaty in which I was involved had as many as 200 lawyers over the course of the 20 years it was negotiated. They all have their fingerprints on it. And I would say involving 200 lawyers in any writing project is probably an invitation to litigation for the next 100 years or so. The Yukon Treaty, in which I was heavily involved in for the next few years, was the first, it said, to be completed without the pressure of a mega project. The negotiations started because the Americans wanted to build a gas line through the southern Yukon. But even after that project died, the negotiations continued, and so it became a social policy objective in its own right. But that was a treaty that involved many hard bargains about practical matters, and the federal and territorial governments negotiated this treaty largely in the Yukon First Nation communities affected, rather than the ballrooms of grand hotels in faraway southern cities. Both the First Nations and their non-status Indian cousins were at the negotiating table in that process, where their joint presence demonstrated that that these two indigenous groups refused to allow the continued Indian Act division of their communities. In addition to the land settlement, the Yukon Treaty also guaranteed subsistence food harvesting, participation in wildlife and natural resource management, guarantees of economic and employment opportunities, plus compensation of $243 million. The texts of Yukon's complicated final agreements contain chapters on everything from education, finance, health, to land and languages. And to limit the potential for requests of repeats of the 19th century broken treaty promises, lawyers for the indigenous parties described the provisions in great detail, dotting every I, crossing every T. And as a result, the Yukon's final agreement supposedly contains more words than the New Testament. For its part, to define and document the land and other rights, Canada enshrines the law in modern treaties negotiated between Aboriginal groups in Ottawa and the province or territory, and gave them Section 35 protection under Canada's 1982 Constitution. Other northern treaties followed, including the Sault Dene and Métis, the Comprehensive Claims, and the Nunavut-Tungavik Agreements of 1993. The treaty with the Inuit of Nunavut gave them collective ownership of 356,000 square kilometers, and in time there would be more than 20 such agreements across northern Canada. In 1992, as you know, the Gwich'in Tribal Council and the governments of Northwest Territories and Canada reached an agreement which gave them a settlement with very substantial quantum of land as well. We will talk more about that later. The first thing I want to say about these northern treaties, and this is not understood in southern Canada, that these modern treaties negotiated with First Nations, the Inuit and the Métis and the Arctic and Subarctic in the years following the 1971 Alaska settlement include great improvements in the land and resource rights for Indigenous people, but they are in striking contrast to the 19th century treaties that consigned Canadian First Nations to reserves and American Indians to reservations, largely on marginal land and almost permanent poverty. In fact, the northern treaties negotiated late in the 20th century dwarfed their 19th century predecessors. For example, in 1992, 7,000 Dene and Tlingit secured title to 41,000 square kilometers in the Yukon, along with subsurface rights to 2/3 of that land. To put this in context, this is more land than is contained in all the Indian reserves in southern Canada, which are home to 500,000 people. Because the community-based negotiations typically took up to 20 years, with active consultation with non-Indigenous citizens, the resulting agreements contain sensible measures for sharing power over lands and resources between the Indigenous and settler communities, particularly in the Western Arctic. While these northern treaties recognize title to tens of thousands of square kilometers of resource-rich land, they also reestablish Indigenous governance of those lands. And what's more, they honor sustainability and stewardship, including wildlife co-management boards that favor conservation and subsistence harvesting over recreational and commercial fishing and hunting. Thus, the principle of sustainability is embedded right into these northern treaties, particularly those negotiated after 1986. They are the only part of Canada's constitutional order to embed sustainability in the constitutional fabric of the country. And significantly, the boards, the co-management boards, when they work because they involve a sharing of power between Indigenous Northerners and settlers. In other words, they operate as instruments of regional government rather than national government, and they remain accountable to local communities. Now, only national governments can make treaties. So federal representatives from both the US and Canada came north to negotiate the surrender of Aboriginal Indian title to the lands in questions, or the lands, in fact, they wanted to exploit, well knowing the broken treaty promises of the 19th century treaties, and having greater appreciation of the value of their lands, Indigenous Northerners had no intention of selling their birthright on the cheap. No quick and dirty deals were on offer this time around. Rather than a few days of hassling at frontier trading posts, some Arctic and subarctic treaty negotiations, as I said, took 20 years to complete. And, as federal negotiators soon discovered, both Indigenous and settler populations had their own demands. Now, I want to say something about settler participants, because this is often forgotten in the discussion about the real struggles that went on to achieve these treaties. In Alaska and the Canadian territories, settler legislators, both opponents and supporters, helped shape the agreements, while one scholar, SFU public policy professor Doug MacArthur, argues that the federal priorities often seem to be mainly about money. In the 19th century and early 20th, nobody doubted that Indian treaties involved only the tribes and their federal government. Late in the 20th century, in both Alaska and Canada's Northern Territories, local, non-Indigenous or settler populations gained a voice in the treaty negotiations. Ultimately, hard work and compromises by both Indigenous peoples and regional governments helped national governments achieve reconciliation. And this part I would ask you not to forget. But in the 1970s, when modern land claims negotiations first got underway in the Canadian Arctic, we should not forget that a settler backlash erupted. And in those days, prominent liberals in my part of the world used to quote a speech by Prime Minister Pierre Elliott Trudeau given at the Seaforth Armory on August 8, 1969, in which he said, quote, "We won't recognize Aboriginal rights," Trudeau said, "because the treaties shouldn't go on forever. It's inconceivable, I think, that in a given society, one section of society should have a treaty with the other section of society. We must all be equal under the laws, and we must not sign treaties amongst ourselves. Indians should become Canadians, as are all other Canadians," close quotes. Non-Aboriginal residents of the northern communities, for example, Daniel Lang, a young conservative legislator, loudly opposed Yukon Aboriginal land claims. Lang helped found something called the Northern Land Research Society. And October 20th, 1975, the Toronto Star story called Indian Claims Stir Yukon Racism described this young man as speaking for a growing white resentment. Quote, I would hate to split the Yukon, but I'm sure we could get 8,000 people behind us if we worked at it. The animosity that's growing here is unbelievable. I will tell you this, if you're going to give land away where I've always hunted, the only way you'll get me off is to carry me off, close quote. In the same period, across the mountains in the Northwest Territories, Wally Firth, a Gwich'in Métis political organizer, campaigned against building the Mackenzie Valley Pipeline until land claims were settled. And in 1972, Firth decisively won the NWT seat in Parliament on exactly that platform. And as you know, the following year, Thomas Berger Commission was appointed. There was a minority government which facilitated that creation, and the Berger ended up writing his Northern Homeland, Northern Frontier report, which put off the pipeline and actually, I would argue, very much changed the political discourse about land claims and pipelines, not just in the NWT, but across northern Canada. But it's also useful to remember, in the Yukon Territory where I was, while the Yukon Native Brotherhood, later the CYI and CYFN, presented its land claims to Pierre Elliott Trudeau in 1973, at that time, it was clear that environmental, labor, and women's movement supporters were actually supporting Aboriginal rights and assisting the settlement of them. And given in a territory where Indigenous people were already a minority, without that support, probably settlements would have been impossible. Some Yukoners viewed the post-1973 treaty process as divisive and disruptive of the established order of settler privilege. Others acknowledged that negotiations helped build bridges across tribal and ethnic divides. They might even reestablish links between different First Nations. The Alaska Federation of Natives, for example, brought together Inupiaq, Yupik, Dene, Aleut, Tlingit, and Haida leaders, many of whom had first met and got to know each other at residential school. They'd all gone to the same residential school, so when they came to form a leadership group in the AFN to argue for a land claim in Alaska, they already had a camaraderie among them, a kind of knowledge intertribal relationship which didn't exist later after the land claim settled necessarily. And as mentioned in the neighboring Canadian territory, the Yukon Native Brotherhood, were the same tribal groups as exist in Alaska. The Native Brotherhood and later the Council for Yukon Indians and later the Council for Yukon First Nations refused to let the federal government's Indian Act divide their community. Instead, they chose to unite First Nation status and non-status Indians in a common front at negotiating tables. By 1982, of course, as you all know, Canada and the provinces had amended the Canada's Constitution, adding Section 35, which states, you heard about this earlier today, the existing Aboriginal and treaty rights of Aboriginal peoples of Canada are hereby recognized and affirmed. In this act, Aboriginal peoples of Canada includes Indian, Inuit, and Métis peoples of Canada. And it is important to remember, though, that in those discussions, neither the Aboriginal peoples nor the territorial governments had a vote in that constitutional process. In the constitutional conferences that crafted that agreement and Section 35. And yet I would argue Canada's Constitution, while Canada's Constitution became the first to recognize Aboriginal rights, the major architects of the agreements that happened after that were, in fact, northern peoples. Multi-year negotiations in northern communities required active consultation with non-Indigenous citizens, and the long-term benefits of these interactions is that settler and Indigenous leaders started, I would argue for the first time, to talk to each other, really talk to each other, and work together. Negotiators representing Arctic Indigenous peoples involved in concurrent treaty-making negotiations during the 1990s from both the Dene, Gwich'in, Satu, Klitschko, Yukon, Inuit, Inuvialuit, Labrador, Nunavik, Nunavut communities compared notes and still work together today, even now in the Aboriginal Land Claims Coalition, which lobbies Ottawa on implementation issues. Yet, it must be admitted that even with successful land claims negotiations and the treaties, self-government agreements, assimilationist thinkers, such as Tom Flanagan, perhaps the most famous in Canada, continue to echo the sentiments of Vancouver-born U.S. Republican Senator S.I. Hayakawa, who famously said of America's land, "We stole it fair and square." I want to talk now about jurisdiction, or what I call inches of jurisdiction. In Canada, the restoration of Indigenous jurisdiction has recently slowed to a crawl, and the full implementation of treaties remains in doubt. Whenever a Southern Canadian spares a thought for land claims or Northern treaties, they tend to think of the concrete aspect of those treaties, land. They give far less attention to the more abstract concept of jurisdiction. And this is why I think if I look at the Northern treaties as a whole, or treaty making in Canada in the last 4 or 5 decades, it's been about acres of land and inches of jurisdiction. In British policy, as set out in the Royal Proclamation of 1763, land and jurisdiction go together. To hold vast lands without the power to make the rules about their use vacates the rights of owners. What is the point of that? As Canada opened up its western regions with a transcontinental railroad, it negotiated a series of numbered treaties. Treaties have usually been motivated by a megaproject, driven by a megaproject. At Fort Carleton in 1876, Cree chiefs met Canada's treaty commissioners to negotiate Treaty 6, an event full of government-to-government, nation-to-nation formalities, and ceremony and solemnity. Ironically, that same year, 1876, Parliament passed an Indian Act that completed the ignominious transformation of Indian nations from allies of Britain and France into wards of the Canadian state. Later, though, almost 100 years later, the scale of the 1971 Alaska land claim settlement galvanized First Nations in Canada, Inuit and Métis negotiators everywhere. But the United States Congress' insistence on corporate as opposed to tribal governance in Alaska came as a huge disappointment. Indigenous Canadians still preferred the cultural familiarity of Aboriginal self-government, or what the Americans would call tribal government. By 1992, Yukon First Nations had negotiated Canada's first third-order Aboriginal self-government agreements with the Government of Canada and with the Yukon Territorial Government. Now, third order means that Aboriginal groups should be recognized as the third tier of government alongside federal and provincial jurisdictions. The Yukon self-government agreements recognize both local and quasi-provincial powers for the territory's First Nations. And I want you to understand the significance of this. Nowhere else in Canada do villages have quasi-provincial powers. Only in Northern Canada. And I don't think Southern Canadians have a clue that that is actually what's happened. When the Nisga'a tried to build on, well, I didn't say tried, they succeeded, building on the 1992 Yukon model of self-government agreements, the Nisga'a went one step further. The Yukon self-government agreements only have statutory protection. The Nisga'a managed to weave the self-government provisions throughout their treaty and then consolidate them in Chapter 11. And they reversed the historical trend of Indigenous disempowerment by negotiating province-like powers right into the text of their treaty. With the support of the provincial NDP and the federal Liberal governments. However, the British Columbia opposition leader, Gordon Campbell, had denounced the Nisga'a self-government chapter as race-based government and asked the BC Supreme Court to declare that treaty unconstitutional. Now, this is a very important moment, because had he won that case, it would have had a powerful impact everywhere in Canada. As it happened, he didn't win the case, and when he became Premier, he appealed the decision to the Court of Public Opinion with a province-wide referendum on Aboriginal self-government. And Campbell's 2002 referendum question proposed that Aboriginal self-government should have the characteristics of local or municipal government with powers delegated powers from Canada and British Columbia. As many people in the public debate that followed, Tom Berger including, who talked about the inherent right of First Nations, and other people talking about, I myself wrote an op-ed in the Vancouver Sun pointing out that First Nations in the Yukon Territory, but this is true also in many other places, don't have much interest in dog bylaws and parking meters. What they're actually interested in is fish and game, the land and waters around them. The powers they seek are in fact seen by most Canadians as provincial powers, and that indeed is the problem, because Canadians usually think of these powers as provincial, and that therefore, especially for provincial cabinets, who it seems are even less willing to share jurisdiction than federal ministers. And indeed, when I was at the table in British Columbia, it was very clear that if a province opposed a jurisdictional power, the federal government's position was, if the province opposed, we're not going to do it. Now, let me move on to the question of implementation, because I think we've short-changed jurisdiction, but there's also a problem in Canada on implementation of modern treaties. To address the numerous federal implementation failures experienced by its members, the Land Claims Agreement Coalition was formed in 2003. The members, whose comprehensive land claims agreements involve more than 40% of Canada's landmass, and the waters and the resources in those regions, include the Grand Council of the Cree, the Gwich'in Tribal Council, the Inuvialuit Regional Corporation, the Council of Yukon First Nations, and almost all the other modern treaty holders. Most of Canada's northern treaties with northern Indigenous nations include chapters containing standard, off-the-shelf, alternative dispute resolution tools, including mediation. Only a minority of Indigenous groups, notably the Inuvialuit, the Nisga'a, and the Inuit of Nunavut, were successful in bargaining arbitration provisions into their treaties. But that proved, in the case of the Inuit, to be a Pyrrhic victory. Because even after NTI had tried 17 times to invoke the arbitration clauses in the Nunavut Treaty, Canada's Department of Finance refused to participate even in the legally sanctioned arbitrations provided for in the treaties. That left NTI with no choice but to sue the government, and as you all know, after many frustrating years, they eventually achieved an out-of-court settlement, a very substantial out-of-court settlement, in the run-up to the last federal election. Allegedly, there was a certain MP seat was actually at risk, put it politely. In May 2008, the Standing Committee on Aboriginal Peoples of the Canadian Senate issued a report called Honoring the Spirit of Modern Treaties, Closing the Loopholes. Their interim report from our special study about implementing comprehensive land claims agreements, the Senate report says that failure to implement these treaties is, quote, as destructive of the process of reconciliation as some of the larger and more explosive controversies. The report then closes with a quotation for one of the committee's witnesses, which said, failure to faithfully implement the provisions of these treaties as negotiated puts Canada at risk of generating a new legends of broken treaty promises for our country. This is not a trivial matter. Close quotes. that is a view with which I agree completely. On the more positive side, let me talk for a moment about the international implications of the treaty making in the North. Canada's northern treaties attracted much attention in the circumpolar world. Greenlanders who achieved home rule in 1979 and more recently self-government followed the negotiations of their Inuit cousins in Alaska, the NWT in Nunavut and James Bay, as they realized their own dreams of self-determination. In 1991, after the Cold War ended, Indigenous Russians attending the founding meeting of the Northern Forum for Regional Governments at Anchorage swarmed Alaskan and Northern Canadians for information about land claims, land rights, Aboriginal self-government processes. Out of these interactions, Norway borrowed the Yukon co-management ideas for its Finnmark Act of 2005, which transferred powers over northern lands to a board composed of 3 Sami and 3 municipal politicians who now make decisions, land use and resource decisions in that area. And as you all know, in the last few weeks, Sweden's Sami reindeer herders recently won in court a 30-year battle for certain land rights. Also, I'm sure you know, a handful of the Northern Canadian treaties, including the Labrador, Inuit, and Yukon agreements and others, contain clauses on international obligations regarding cooperation on conservation and the rights to participate in Canadian delegations in negotiations regarding caribou, salmon, and polar bears. No Indigenous American nation has a seat in the United Nations General Assembly. But the UN has not been indifferent to developments in Canada and other countries with large Indigenous populations. And as I know you know, on September 13th, 2007, the United Nations General Assembly adopted the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, UNDRIP, with innovative international arrangements. Pre-existing communities, political communities in the Arctic. 6 Indigenous people organizations joined the Arctic Council as permanent participants. The Sami, fishers and reindeer herders, whose members live in Russia, Finland, Sweden, and Norway. The Inuit, whose homelands stretch from Russia to Alaska, from Arctic Canada to Greenland. The Athabascans, whose traditional territories preceded the creation of Canada, the United States, and whose territory exists not only in Alaska, Yukon, and the Northwest Territories, but also south of the 60th parallel. And the Gwich'in Council International, whose lands lie in Alaska, the Yukon, and NWT, and the Aleut, who live in Russia and Alaska. Plus the Chukchi, Events, Khanty, Nenets, and others who comprise Russian Association of Indigenous Peoples, RAPON. These groups have achieved a unique status of permanent participants with a voice, if not a vote, in the proceedings of the 8-nation Arctic Council. And I argue this is something that would have been inconceivable without the advent of modern northern treaties and the legitimation of Indigenous land ownership and government. The United Nations has recognized Canada's efforts at reconciliation in the northern region. Still, in 2004, UN human rights expert James Anaya wrote, quote, "The well-being gap between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people in Canada has not narrowed over the past several years. Treaty and Aboriginal claims remain persistently unresolved. Indigenous women and girls remain vulnerable to abuse. And overall, there appear to be high levels of distrust among Indigenous peoples towards government at both the federal and provincial level." That is the world's view of Canada on this question, and it is a sobering perspective. But now I want to come back to what I want to argue is a good news perspective. Northern peoples crafted the Northern Treaties But Indigenous peoples in the South still face uphill struggles. Indigenous American communities tend to hold and govern their lands collectively and for the common good. Ideologically, settlers often reject this notion. After the United States government forcibly relocated the Cherokee to the Indian Territory of Oklahoma, Massachusetts Senator Henry Dawes wrote legislation forcing them to subdivide their tribal lands so that they could learn the selfishness on which Dawes wrote civilization was based. Theodore Roosevelt praised Dawes' legislation as, quote, a mighty pulverizing engine to break up the tribal mass, close quote. Dawes and Roosevelt both understood the essential link between tribal government and tribal lands. 95 years later, when Congress was legislating a settlement of the Alaska Native claims, U.S. Senator Henry Jackson of Washington State, sponsor of the Alaska Native Claims Act, declared that he did not want to see racial enclaves established in Alaska. So Congress outlawed tribal governments and mandated instead the establishment of state-regulated Native corporations as the landowner, thereby severing Alaska tribal governments from Alaska tribal lands. Regardless, the idea of tribal government in Alaska did not die completely. In his 10-year review of the Alaska land claim settlement for the Alaska Federation of Natives, Thomas Berger recommended the restoration of tribal government as the means to protect their lands. Unfortunately, the author of the major work on the Alaska land claim settlements described Berger's views as essentially hopelessly romantic. But remember that as late as 1969, our Prime Minister, Pierre Elliott Trudeau, still opposed Aboriginal rights. He said, we cannot recognize Aboriginal rights because no society can be built on historical might-have-beens, he said. We will be just in our time, that is all we can do, we will be just today, close quote. But we should not forget that Premier Gordon Campbell asked the Supreme Court to declare self-government chapter of the Nisga'a Treaty unconstitutional. And in rejecting Campbell's petition, the BC Supreme Court of British Columbia said, self-government rights, quote, cannot be extinguished, but they may be defined given content in a treaty. The Nisga'a Agreement does the latter expressly. And as we know, Campbell appealed the Campbell decision to the Court of Public Opinion with the province-wide referendum, and he won the referendum, but he lost the war, because it turned out that position that he was arguing was not sustainable at treaty tables. Eventually, both Trudeau and Campbell changed their minds. The Supreme Court of Canada divided decision on Calder, the Nisga'a land rights case at the Supreme Court, caused Trudeau's perspective to begin to change, and as I said, as Prime Minister, he sent treaty negotiators to British Columbia, Quebec, the Northwest Territories, and the Yukon. And Campbell himself, Premier Campbell, eventually negotiated a new relationship accord with First Nations. I won't read it to you here now, but as a political statement, it was one of the most remarkable post-colonial political statements ever. The trouble is, it was never implemented. But the big message is that change has been slow to come to southern Canada. And I want to, without being too poetic, say that the 20-plus modern or northern treaties have provided acres of land and only inches of jurisdiction. These agreements have provided for Indigenous ownership of over 600,000 square kilometers of land, financial transfers of $3.2 billion, co-management regimes, resource revenue sharing, and lawmaking powers. With the 350,000 plus square kilometers, the Inuit of Nunavut became the largest private landowners in the world. These treaties, in my view, amount to the most important constitutional developments in Canada since patriation in 1982. In the northernmost regions of North America, negotiators regained much indigenous jurisdiction, but everywhere else, the pace of jurisdictional progress has been glacial. In Louise Erdrich's 2012 National Book Award-winning novel, The Roundhouse, Basil, a tribal judge, spends his working life trying to reclaim, as he puts it, indigenous jurisdiction inch by inch. Nevertheless, Canadian Indigenous law expert Professor John Burroughs believes that, in some ways, the situation of American tribes is superior to that of the Canadian counterparts. To its credit, there was mention made of this today, Canada's Supreme Court has, in the recent Tilsicort decision, recognized for the first time a nation's Aboriginal title without negotiations. That said, the court has yet to define Aboriginal self-government rights under Section 35. And here is the saddest part of this story. Of the 22 self-government agreements negotiated in Canada, the majority of them were crafted by Northerners more than 20 years ago. The progress since has been pitiful. The Northern Treaties and self-government agreements should count as enormous nation-building achievements, and they should make all Northerners, especially young Northerners, proud. But few in Southern Canada know anything about them. Think about this. Modern treaties and self-government agreements were invented in the Northern Bush. If I'm being poetic, I'll say, were born in the Northern Bush. In Alaska, Greenland, Quebec, Yukon, NWT. But they have gotten completely lost in the southern cities. My kids, who are status Indians, members of the White River First Nation, we talked about identity today, have, I think, quite complex identities. They're first citizens of a Canadian First Nation, but their tribal affiliation is largely Alaskan. Most of the Tanana people live in the state of Alaska. They were educated in the public schools in the Yukon Territory in French. So in that sense, they're good Canadians. But they also, because of my ancestors, have EU passports. So they hop on and off planes and go to Europe, even go work there with no problem. On the citizenship question, they have no, I think, uncertainty about their First Nation identity, and they're proud of it. But I think a reality for a lot of people of your generation is they have multiple identities. Many of them have actually more than one tribal affiliation. Many have European and tribal affiliations or ancestry. And they talk about that without any, with pride. But the thing I want to say to your generation, people of your generation, the leaders of that generation, it will be your task in the next generation to give Canadian treaty-making new direction, new hope, because it needs your energy, it needs your imagination, it needs your passion, it needs your commitment. The same as was shown by your parents and grandparents in achieving the Northern Treaties that we now have. Thank you. Sinicho, Masicho, Kunishchis.
You could have just dropped the mic.
Yeah.
Thank you, Tony. Every time I get to hang out with you, I become more and more educated in terms of your history and the Indigenous history in the North. I believe that just like you stated, that we come from very strong people, and that when these negotiations were going on, it was a bunch of young people that are sitting in front of us, all in their 20s, all making commitments to being to making our communities a better place. So the one question that I have, just to start off the question period, is why do you think that the North has been more successful than the rest of Canada in achieving modern treaties?
Well, for a start, because it was federal territory. And for all the criticism made about the federal government, the federal government had the kind of clout, including ownership of land in their view, and political power to be able to make treaties. But I think, as I tried to say, and I don't want to go on too much about this, I think the negotiating process itself, rather than the treaties, also changed the North. People from every community began to realize that they had a stake in what was happening and wanted to participate in the talks, and did. And academics like Doug MacArthur argued if you look at the self-government agreements, the federal government didn't have much of a stake in that game. But the Northerners did, and they fought very hard to get what they achieved. If you look at, just take one item, which is very common in Northern treaties, the co-management agreements. It's relatively easy if you go to Northern Alberta or Northern British Columbia to imagine similar kind of arrangements with Dene or Cree, Chipewyan or Denisulan communities. But when you get down into heavily populated areas around Vancouver, it's actually inconceivable that you could actually have an easy time negotiating similar agreements. For a start, Vancouver, the largest single ethnic group in Vancouver is now Chinese. People who don't feel any particular attachment to British legal heritage or the Royal Proclamation of 1763. It had nothing to do with them. From their point of view, perhaps, I'm speculating, but they may say, look, the injustices that were done to Indigenous people in Canada, we didn't do that. We also were victimized during the colonial period. Why should we have to pay and go through the frustration? No, I'm not saying that's everybody's view, but it may well be. And it may be that now that 60% of First Nations in Canada live in 6 Western Canadian cities, and you have to start thinking about what does a land claim and self-government mean in a city, a big city, then it becomes even more challenging. But you think about British Columbia. British Columbia treaty process, which was started in 1992, has spent $1 billion and got, what, 5 agreements with 5 small communities? And then since the Gwich'in decision, a bunch of First Nations said, the hell with spending 20 years on lawyers and negotiators, and that thing we'll just go straight to court. The thing about the Gwich'in decision, though, that they're now realizing is, guess what? When you get a decision like that from the court, you have to start negotiating. You have to start negotiating with not just one provincial department, many provincial departments. You have to negotiate with not just Indian, Aboriginal, Northern Affairs, whatever it's called, Indigenous and something. It keeps changing its name. But many agencies. You have to start negotiating with the municipalities all around you. It is actually, I mean, if I look at the other end of that telescope, I was talking at an American university not too long ago, and they asked, well, how do you measure the progress of self-government? Well, my answer is you measure it by the number of intergovernmental agreements the self-governing nation has, the total number. Because in the old days, they just had an arrangement, chiefs had an arrangement with Indian and Northern Affairs. They basically were accountable to Indian agents because that's where they got their money. Now that the taxation powers the First Nations have, they've forced them to become accountable to their own citizens. But also to deliver services, they have to make agreements with other tribal groups, with sewer and water services. They have to make deals with local municipalities. They may have recreational facilities which they want to make available to a larger community, so they make those kind of agreements. In order to run a school board, most 200-person First Nations in BC can't do that. They need to think about a larger aggregation in order to do that successfully. It is once you have established the right to self-government, it sort of begins a new generation of negotiation, which is about intergovernmental agreements with everybody all around you. So I think it was demographics was the answer. It was federal authority over the lands and the peoples. Remember when I was a kid, not your age, when I was a kid, the reality really, if you're being honest about what it was, even the territorial government and the territorial legislature in the Yukon goes back to the turn of not the last century, not this one. But even then, we understood that Indigenous people dealt with the Minister of Indian Affairs. Non-Indigenous people dealt with the Minister of Northern Affairs. We were both colonized. We both had to relate to a great white father who was expected to solve all the problems that are away in Ottawa. What changed with the land claims negotiations is we started to have to deal with each other. And when you deal with each other respectfully, you build community. You build understanding. And you make the places, make the NWT and the Yukon governable. Nunavut's a very different place, but and that process is not finished yet. It's got a long way to go. And I think what has been achieved in governance, just the architecture of governance north of 60, is unlike anything else in Canada. And I think it is remarkable in many ways because it actually is influencing other Arctic jurisdictions. But I repeat my point. I don't think hardly anybody in Southern Canada knows anything about it.
Thank you for your presentation. I work for the Delaney First Nation on their implementation. They're implementing the first community self-government in Canada. And on September 1st, the Delaney-Gwich'in government will come into effect. So it's a pretty exciting time.
Congratulations, yeah.
I'm really honored to be working on it. And something that I experience in my work and something I hear in your presentation is that there's an incredible opportunity for a lot of learning and educating and a lot of conversations to happen all over Canada, maybe especially in the South, about what self-government means, what these jurisdictions mean, what they can mean, what we want them to mean in terms of our relationships. And to me, I think a lot of what can happen there, maybe what needs to happen, is space to ask questions and to feel that it's okay to ask questions, the simplest ones, the most complicated ones. And I wondered what your thoughts are on what that kind of learning and educating ourselves, that unlearning, what that can look like, what your recommendations are for that.
I think the questions not asked are fatal. 10 years after we finished the Yukon negotiations, a famous foundation invited Dave Joe, who was my neighbor in Whitehorse, but also the first First Nation lawyer in the territory, first First Nation person to graduate from university. I mean, you know, he was a pioneer in many, well, that's a funny word to use, but anyway. But they asked us both to come and talk about, and finally someone asked the question, well, if you had to do the Yukon Treaty again, what would you do differently? And I said it's ridiculous to have a 356-word treaty, whatever it is, because almost nobody, most beneficiaries will never read it, which is a problem by itself. This is now the Constitution in the sense for the territory. The Constitution for the United States of America is 12 pages, the most powerful nation on earth. Why did we not have the wisdom, if I had to do it again, to say, okay, we've finished the negotiations, the lawyers have dotted their I's and crossed the T's. Why don't we then recognize that a 356-page constitutional document is ridiculous? What we need to do now is sit down and describe in the principles we've agreed to, probably should have done that at the beginning, and put them as the core of the treaty, on all the stuff about the quorum for a wildlife committee and what day of the week it meets, which doesn't belong in a constitutional document, should be an appendix or an administrative appendix, which you could change if you want to change it to Wednesday, by agreement of the other parties. But we were so fearful. We didn't ask the questions. We were so fearful of doing the wrong thing or upsetting the apple cart or annoying other people. I mean, it was awful negotiations. Every time you wanted to do something innovative, the federal justice people would say it was unconstitutional. The federal finance people say you can't afford it, and sometimes it was other people. Or they had to go back and the negotiators check their mandates and get their mandates approved, which took forever. We went through many ministers in our process. We went through many deputy ministers. And a lot of the time, I think if we'd had the kind of trust or the confidence, maybe that's it, to ask those dumb questions, we actually would have moved things along much better. Barry Stewart, who was my chief negotiator for much of the time, who was the chief territorial court judge who stepped off the bench in order to do our negotiations, actually said that if he was going to do the negotiations now, we would actually start with a session which was just frankly a round table where you actually expressed your interests, not your bargaining positions, but your interests. And you would actually bring in mediators right at the beginning to actually help people move past those cultural barriers, linguistic misunderstandings, and so forth. I mean, they were numerous. This Dave Joe was a very funny story at one point where somebody from the federal government saying, well, we can't have self-government power. I mean, what if First Nations want to change the criminal code, and have their own criminal code? And David, who had a sense of humor, said, well, of course you're all right. I mean, half of our people are in jail. And even those of us who are here today are on day release. You can't trust us to do anything like that. I mean, and then people laughed, and then they finally realized that what the feds had said was a ridiculous point. There was a question Jordan asked about tribal justice. I mean, they have tribal justice provisions in the Yukon Agreement, but in 20 years, no First Nation's been able to implement them. Partly because you have a treaty, but it doesn't mean the federal departments you have to negotiate with are going to go willingly down that road. And maybe we should have asked a few more questions when the time was right. Asking questions, that's the beginning of an education, but I think even now, maybe the Northern Treaties even need a debate in Southern Canada about them, because it's only then, if you're getting stories in the Globe and Mail and the Toronto Star and the media. I mean, I wish, God bless, CBC doesn't have any money anymore, but somebody would actually do a serious documentary series about the Northern Treaties, because they did change the country.
I got another question, Tony. It's just about your remark in terms of the way that these treaty negotiations happen and the documents, the gigantic documents that came out of them. And I'm just thinking of, in terms of our theme, looking at the next 40 years, or even looking at the next 5-10 years, how do you think that we should change the way that we are looking at negotiations with the federal government? As I know right now, the Gwich'in Tribal Council, they put forward a position paper on their AIP of what they wanted to start negotiating off of.
Okay. Well, I have lots of thoughts about that. And in fact, as you mentioned, I wrote a whole book about it, about how long the treaty process takes. And in fact, I wanted to call the book Treaty Time, being deeply ironic. But my publisher wouldn't use that title, so we had something polite. When I was the deputy minister responsible for the big table treaty negotiations in British Columbia, I had a number of ideas which I had a special negotiating team of 6 people. We had less than a year. Out of that year, we developed a new consultation process which would require every single official in the government to consult with First Nations when they were planning to do anything that might have an impact on Aboriginal rights and title. This was following the Delgamuukw decision, when the Supreme Court had actually made some effort to describe, they affirmed the existence of these rights and then told governments, federal and provincial, how you can get rid of them, which was not exactly a win-win. But the key thing we did on treaties, which was work, is amazingly how quickly we invented a new form of interim measure called treaty-related measure, which would essentially allow First Nations to have a down payment on the treaty in land or other resources, forests or whatever, proportionate to how far along they were in the process. So instead of having to wait 20 years before you got anything, you'd be able to get substantial down payments on the way. But they had to be tripartite agreements. In other words, in BC, where the feds put up the money and the province puts up the land, both of those parties had to be on board. But the big thing we did, and the work I'm most proud of, we actually developed a fast-track treaty, which was, instead of in the BCTC process, you have to go through 6 stages, and you don't actually start negotiating until you get to the 4th stage. We said, instead of the government being secret about what its mandates are, about what it's offering in terms of land and money, why don't we draft up a treaty, which is essentially an offer, based on the federal government of provinces all have per capita formulas about how much land or how much money you should get. Write up the treaty. Do what they did in Alaska, where you actually got a treaty based on the land quantum, but the land selections came after the treaty. And the rules about the land selections have to be representative of the general character of the land, so you can't pick all farmland. You've got to pick some swampland, some mountains, all that kind of stuff. And also commit to doing self-government within 2 years of actually signing the treaty. And we wrote this fast-track treaty up. It wasn't 356 pages, it was 30 pages, and we included everything that was in the treaties that had been done up to that point. And we actually had a provincial premier in BC who was actually liked the project, was excited about it, thought it was a real game-changing initiative, allowed me to release it publicly for discussion. And then he got caught in some kind of scandal and disappeared, and the next premier didn't understand it at all, and it sort of disappeared. But there are people out there who've actually done some work that would actually move it along if you really wanted to. I think, though, you don't get treaties in Canada nowadays, unless you get an alignment, like planetary alignment of political will, both at the Indigenous level, the provincial level, and the federal government. You need a provincial premier who's committed to getting a deal. You need a federal minister who's committed to get a deal, and you need Indigenous leadership that also are ready to actually settle. When I'm not being cynical about Canada, I think Canada is a very liberal country. I'm not talking politics now, I'm just talking about generally liberal. I once asked a federal finance official in a moment of high frustration, why do you guys keep wanting to negotiate forever without settling? Just endless negotiating. He said, frankly, Tony, because it's cheaper to negotiate than settle. Well, I think he's wrong. I think perpetual negotiations actually build cynicism, they're bad faith. But it's actually what we do internationally too. We believe in, Canadians, we believe in constructive engagement, but we don't actually believe in solving problems. We want to be the good guys out there tinkering, but we don't actually want to be there and do the gutsy stuff, which is actually taking the risks and selling the settlements and selling the deals and doing the really hard stuff of negotiating agreements. And if there were a small change I would want to make is, it's not the public servants. Public servants are very competent people, but in our culture, they are risk averse. I think the best model in treaty negotiations is a private sector negotiator leading a public sector team, but a private sector negotiator who has access to a minister, ready access to a minister, and who actually has the flexibility to do something with their mandates. Because you'll never, ever get a treaty based on a federal or provincial mandate. I've read them. The First Nations, if they looked at them, and they were often leaked anyway, will say, we're not going to agree to that. We got better off with what the courts have given us as much as we can get from the courts. We're just as well off just carrying on as we are. So we do need to have the will to settle. And I hope the new Prime Minister has that. He said lots of good things. But it needs to bring in some tough negotiators to the table in order to get done what needs to be done. Have I talked too much? Sorry. Oh, okay.
What's your perspective on devolution? Because as I understand it, it had a major impact on the implementation of self-government in Yukon.
In the Yukon, it was very different than devolution in Nunavut, for example, which I also spent some years working on. I think the thing about devolution in the Yukon, there was a tension, as there was in the Northwest Territories, between Indigenous communities and the non-Indigenous community. But let me talk about the Yukon first. This is very broad brushstrokes, politics, but while First Nations very much wanted their land claim settlement as the #1 priority, for non-Indigenous people, devolution, control of lands and resources was much more important. And in fact, when Eric Nielsen was Deputy Prime Minister, he actually offered me a devolution deal ahead of land claims. Now, apart from anything that I thought that would have been evil, I was leading a caucus, half of whom were Indigenous. There was no possibility we were ever going to agree to that. So we said, yes, we want to do this, but we want to do land claims first. And even when we got into land claims, there were lots of arguments about resource revenue sharing, and some First Nations wanted a veto over the devolution deal, which politically was not acceptable. You had similar tensions in the Northwest Territories, but the Northwest Territories, I got the sense there that it was very much about money, while the territorial government was willing to share 25%. I think I'm talking ballpark here. 25% of the resource revenues. the First Nations actually wanted 50%, and they didn't get an agreement on that by the time they did the devolution deal. Now, the problem in the devolution deal in the NWT, I think, is you've got two significant First Nation groups that haven't settled land claims. And does this now put them in a position of having to negotiate a land settlement with the territorial government as opposed to the federal government? Remember what I said earlier about it's only the federal government can make treaties. So it seems to me that's created a complication at those tables. In Nunavut, the issue has been, I mean, just let me say one other thing was wrong with the problem with the devolution deals in both territories is the federal government has capped the amount of money you can get. You contrast that with what Greenland has done, or what Denmark has done with Greenland, where the clawback for every new resource dollar is 50 cents. When I was leading the Yukon government, the clawback on new revenue was $1.09, which gave a powerful disincentive to do economic development. But we wanted to do it anyway because our calculus about development was jobs. I mean, in fact, the truth about it for the Yukon, the formula financing arrangements were so good that we could actually afford to focus on job creation rather than worrying about balancing our budget. None of it has entirely different challenges. Sorry.
Last question. I have two questions, actually. And
last two questions.
You mentioned earlier that who's going to read a treaty or land claims, and I agree with you because I am a student at Nunavut learning about my land claims, and I never knew about it until I started studying there. And I always wondered why I never learned it in high school growing up or heard about it. And I was wondering do you think it would strengthen a lot of our self-government if we learn about our treaties and land claims in high school? And the second question is the government afraid of us because they have so many restrictions on who we are?
Yeah, I mean, on the first question, I think absolutely. And in fact, it shouldn't take a miracle worker or a brilliant writers to be able to give a short form of the treaty for grade 6 readers. And there should be certainly material and interpreters and people to come in and talk, negotiators and others talk in high school classes about, because this is probably for many people the most important event in their lives in terms of the shaping of the character of the North. On the second question, which was, remind me of what your second question was again.
If the federal government is afraid of us because they have so many restrictions on who we are as a people.
Yeah.
I know I'm fortunate to be from Nunavut and my NLCA, but we learned that there are a lot of other treaties where the people aren't as fortunate as we are.
That's true. But I think in Nunavut, if you look at how did the NTI end up in the court case? At some point, Thomas Berger was hired. There he comes again. As conciliator in the report, and it was originally a financial issue about funding, but he wrote a report largely about education. Said, you will not be able to build an Inuktitut speaking public service in Nunavut until you have Inuktitut language as the language of instruction in high schools, which would take $200 million, probably, I think he asked for, from the federal government in order to facilitate that. Now, I know enough about the Nunavut budget to know that they don't have the money to actually add that to their budget. They have $1 billion budget, and they're having cost overruns for things like housing and everything else that are urgent demands there. Given the money we spend in Canada on French and English language training, on bilingualism, I had a group of students who were in the Gordon Arctic Fellows program, the Glasgow Arctic Fellows program last year, who actually wrote a paper about the survival of indigenous languages in the North. And one of their recommendations was not to ask the federal government for money, but to ask them essentially to open up the Official Languages Act so that you include not just English and French, but you recognize indigenous languages in the country as part of the national fabric. And I think one of the reasons why that's been a difficult conversation is because in that cultural sense, the federal government is afraid of indigenous people. I mean, some of the things Hurt said today about collective rights and collectivities, I think there are a lot of reasons why that's foreign for the Euro Canadians who basically have run our governments for it's the country's entire existence.
Hi. Thank you for all that wonderful information. It's so concise. But I did want to actually add some additions which I think are important for the broader audience, especially here, and for you guys to share. So if you bear with me, I wanted to make a note, and especially for our youth here, Treaty 8 and Treaty 11 were originally negotiated, and they were they never spoke about ceding the land and surrendering it. But when the government actually went and put up the documents and they were going to sign, they had added that into the treaty. And so this, for me, was an example of how the government used words and linguistics as a form of oppression. So that's one thing to keep in mind. And then I think there was another note about, it was also important to note that some of the money, well, I'm not going to say some because it's different across the way, but in all the negotiations and final agreements, the money that you mentioned, dollar amounts, these monies didn't all make it there. So I find that sometimes comments are made based on judgment and racism that, oh, you got this money, so shut up about it, basically. But some of these monies never made it. So that's something else important to remember. And the other surprising little fact is that the government loaned money to these groups who wanted to go under self-government. So they said, here, we'll give you money for litigation, but because these were millions and millions of dollars, it actually forced these agreements to be made much quicker. And so things were left out and hurried. And so, again, something to keep in mind. I sort of have a question for you, and I think it went along with the young woman here who asked, how do you see the GTC simplifying their agreement to example, a 12-page, so that we can inform our beneficiaries and our membership, and we can understand and implement it? Because James yesterday mentioned, he's like 30 pages in, and he's been in the job for a year. How do we approach this?
Well, let me just respond very quickly to your comments about Treaty 8 and Treaty 11. I mean, there was a court case relatively recently called the Benoit case. And actually, I think Thomas Berger actually represented this case too. The case was interesting because a Treaty 8 beneficiary read the report of the treaty commissioners back to Ottawa, in which the treaty commissioners acknowledged that they had promised the signatories to Treaty 8 that they would never have to be forced to serve in the military or pay taxes. Now, this wasn't a Section 87 exemption. This was a blanket. We'll not pay taxes. So he went to court to try and have that enforced on the argument that this was, it wasn't in the language of the treaty, but the treaty commissioners had admitted they had promised it orally. And the case didn't go anywhere. I think the Supreme Court refused to hear it. Treaty 11 is interesting because there's a legend that in the southwest corner of the Yukon, when the treaty party arrived to try and get the Cascadene to put their X's on the treaty party woke up in the morning and there was a woman chief of the Cascade at the time. They'd disappeared. They'd gone. They'd heard about this treaty and about how it ruined their hunting and fishing rights and put them on these tiny reserves, and so they didn't want one. So they ran away. But they were included in the treaty. When the treaty negotiations started, modern treaty negotiations, somebody went to court and it was say, yeah, this was never implemented. So I think that was the polite language they used. It was never implemented. Now, on the last question about, you were asking again about...
for example, the Gwich'in language.
Yeah. I don't think you should simplify. I think that's a mistake. I think you should get some of your young scholars that are emerging and sit down and extract the principles, the core principles, not the details, not the stuff about committees and boards, but the principles. What are the principles? And I would extract them into the document, which you could actually put on a single page or put on a wall. These are the principles that underlie. And then you maybe go through not an adversarial, but a reconciliation process with the territorial government first. I would do them first. And then the federal government to get to see if they could agree on those reconciliation principles. And then you articulate, and then you put it on a piece of thing that you could hand out to every member, every beneficiary, in Gwich'in and English, forever. Then people would put it on the walls of their cabins and their houses, their apartments, well, luxury condos such as Jordan lives in, you know. And it would be, then they would actually be able to absorb, incorporate, remember, treasure the principles, not the details. It's not simplifying. It's actually extracting the core principles. Thank you very much. Okay. I got my T-shirt here.
Oh, yeah. For token appreciation there, Tony, from Carleton and the Gwich'in Tribal Council.
Thank you very much.
Don't eat it. Don't spend it all in one place. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
You can hang it up wherever you'd like.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
So, what a wonderful first 2 days of the Gwich'in's Youth Week here, and for the plenary sessions. I think that the conversations and the lectures that we've been able to have over the last 2 days have been, I think, educational, eye-opening, and I hope that all the non-Indigenous people here have heard all of our message that we do want to work together, and we do need your help to be able to push forward with a renewed relationship, a healthy relationship. And just thinking back at what Randall said yesterday about the natural laws, I think applies to all of our lives. And I think when we do want to live in a healthy way, we really try to push that into every aspect of our lives. So we've talked a lot about modern treaties, and in reality, it's a partnership, I believe. I mean, we can think back at the colonial history of Canada against Indigenous people, and be pissed off or be mad or whatever it may cause you to feel about the history of what's happened to my people and all of the Indigenous people across Canada. But today I stand here as a young Indigenous person and a leader in the future that I hope that all of you are a part of our journey in terms of strengthening the relationship with Canada. So I really want to thank you. Big thanks to all of our speakers, all of the volunteers from Carleton, School of Public Policy, Carleton University, Mary, who has been a part of the team, Sheila, Francis, and trying to pull us together. I think we've done a tremendous job, and I hope that all of you leave here today feeling inspired to be able to push forward with us. So we will be having Gwich'in testimonials tomorrow and Thursday, and it was supposed to be only for the core group, but we're sending an invite to everyone that if you want to hear a few more Gwich'in speakers, that they will be on the 5th floor in room 5136 tomorrow at 9 a.m. and Thursday at 9 a.m. So we look forward to working together again with Carleton, and thank you, Francis.
I only want to say thank you on behalf of Carleton for honoring us with your presence. It's been a very exciting and rich, wonderful experience for us to have you. I don't know if anyone has mentioned this yet, but the gifts we've been giving, I'm honored to say, were created by our elder, Simon Brascoupé. He is an artist. and he's allowed us to give his art as thank you presents to the speakers. Not to him, of course. So thank you very much, Simon, for that. And thank you all for coming. Thank you for your hard work and leadership. See you all tomorrow, or many of you.
Thank you.